Hi guys, and welcome to the War Story podcast with me, Garrett Jones. I have something different for you today. It's different, but also kind of the same. The intention, the purpose of this podcast is to tell war stories, so that we can remember, so that we won't forget, and so that future generations, hopefully, if they still listen to podcasts, if we haven't blown up the world by then, they might want to listen to. With that being the case, wherever possible, we will have people on from the conflicts that they served in. But sometimes we're not going to be able to get the guests to cover those battles, those campaigns. Where that's the case, well, I will bring on experts in the field, and we have one of those experts today, probably the primary expert when it comes to Sword Beach. His name's Mr. Stephen Fisher. His level of knowledge on the subject is just incredible, as is his book, Sword Beach. I have it myself, thoroughly recommend it. One thing I do ask, guys, if you listen to this podcast, it's probably enjoy war stories, you find something valuable in them, you think that they're important. If that is the case, please share the podcast. One of the things you get with a podcast, I can see the statistics, I can see how many people are listening. Not in a CIA or, Homeland Security intrusive way, but, I can see how many people listen. If everyone shared an episode of the podcast, that would mean that our numbers double every week, every episode, and they don't. And so I'd ask you guys, if you do find these episodes worthwhile, which if you're sitting through 3 hours or whatever it is, you probably do, then please share it, is really all I ask. I'll keep doing this podcast, even if there's only one person listening. Not only because I love the sound of my own voice, but because I think it's worthwhile doing. So please, guys, I spend hours doing this. The guests spend hours doing this. Please spend a few minutes sharing the episode. Right. As I said, Stephen is an expert on Sword Beach. I learned a lot in this episode, and honestly, the amount you'll learn from his book is incredible. Please do go and support him. I'll put Stephen's social media and everything down in the show notes. For those of you who have been sharing, for those of you who have been listening, I do really appreciate it. It's very worthwhile doing, and being a writer could be a lonely job, so it's also nice for me to have these chances to speak to incredibly interesting people for a few hours. So let's get into it, shall we? Stephen, thanks so much for your time today, mate. Thanks for coming on. Congratulations on the book. Incredible bit of work. We're going to dig into it today because obviously today, when we're releasing this episode, is the anniversary of D-Day, the 81st, which, we could talk, I'd like to talk a bit about anniversaries and all of that kind of thing later on. But first of all, can you just give us a bit of a background on yourself and where your interest in World War II and specifically D-Day came from?
Well, thanks for having me on, Gaz. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been interested in military history since I was a kid, I suppose, because I grew up in Germany, West Germany, as it was at the time, because my dad worked for a company that you might be familiar with, NAFI, and he was a district manager. So, yeah, I grew up in Bielefeld and Sennelager, and until the age of 9, and the schools obviously were on the barracks. And so, behind the school playground, you've got all the armoured personnel carriers and that kind of thing. My scout hut was further up into the barracks. And so, every day you're just surrounded by military. And then when I was 9, we moved to Amesbury in Wiltshire. And, I was lucky enough to have a bedroom window that looked out onto a place called Kingbarrow Ridge, a mile away. You walk up to there and you look down on Stonehenge on the other side. But just next to Stonehenge, of course, you have the Royal School of Artillery, and you're at the southern end of Salisbury Plain. And so every day, my bedroom windows would rattle with the gunfire from Lark Hill. And, this is late 80s, early 90s. You get convoys going up and down our road all the time. And again, Dad was working for NAFI, so sometimes I'd go up with him to all of the different bases. I just grew up surrounded by the military. And, it's always been an interest. And I think when I was probably 7, my parents first took me to Normandy. And, first time I saw military history sites, concrete bunkers and all of that sort of thing. And it's just been something that's interested me ever since. When I did my GCSE history project, it was on the D-Day landings. And then I didn't follow history through in my education. I did for my GCSEs and my A levels, but when I went to university, I actually studied something completely different. I did a psychology degree. But when I graduated, I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do as a career. Took a few years out, lived in Japan, taught English. But when I came back and moved back in with my parents briefly, I ended up volunteering with the National Trust at Stonehenge, who own all of the land around Stonehenge. And I spent a year and a half as a full-time volunteer, essentially training to be an archaeologist. And then got paid work in the sector in a maritime archaeology charity. And very early on, I started becoming responsible for all of the military history archaeology that we were doing. One of the very earliest ones was a landing craft wreck in the English Channel, just outside the Solent. And this is one of the landing craft that was bound for Juno Beach. And late on the 5th of June, as it sailed, it capsized. And everyone was rescued, but it deposited its cargo of 2 Centaur tanks from the Royal Marine Armoured Support Group on the seabed. And we were commissioned to make a study as to the viability of legally protecting this as a protected heritage site. And that was the first sort of archaeological project I carried out, and we're going back 14 years now. And ever since then, I've just been doing heritage sites of military heritage sites from an archaeological perspective. And because I don't dive, I wasn't one of the dive team for the charity, I spent more time doing the research. And I drifted further and further into doing the history. And I've been doing that, the last sort of 15 years or so professionally. And eventually it just sort of morphed into guiding, writing histories and that sort of thing. And then, one day I wrote a book.
So, but we will get into D-Day very shortly. But you end up last time, was it the Arctic or the Antarctic you were around? Was it part of work as well?
Yeah, so as following on from all the work I've done in history, back in 2017, I was recruited by National Geographic to be one of their staff on their expedition ships. And these are like very, very small cruise ships, 100 people or so aboard. And we go all over the world. And so I go on these ships, I lecture as a historian, and I drive the Zodiacs around. And I've got the Antarctic bug, I would say, because I first went down a year and a half ago, and I've been back 8 times since then. It's absolutely phenomenal. I love it. So now my winters are spent in Antarctica, and then my summers are spent back here.
So do you have any like personal connections to D-Day itself or the Second World War more broadly?
Not to D-Day. Both my grandparents were in the military. My father's father was a radio operator on Lancasters, but he didn't have any involvement in Normandy. And my mother's father was in Burma fighting the Japanese. He was actually at the Battle of Kohima. And I've looked into both of them. I have my grandfather's logbooks from his time on Lancasters. And with my mother, we've been unpicking a lot of that grandfather's service and exactly how he came to be at Kohima and that kind of thing. I mean, there is a book in it one day. I thought a lot about writing something, but there's a lot to untangle when you're following an individual, or in this case, 2 people. But having my grandfather's logbooks from his time on Lancasters is amazing, because I can look through which raids he was on and then look at what actually happened on those raids. And logbooks are so sterile, really. They just give you the takeoff time and the return time and like the briefest of notes. But when you actually look at the reports from the squadron logs and the wider reports of the raids themselves, you sort of understand, it was far from sterile. It was usually a lot worse.
What squadron was your grandfather?
He was in 2 squadrons. He was in 75 Squadron, which was a New Zealand squadron. He's not a New Zealander. And I forget the other one. There was a Pathfinder squadron. But he moved twice. He was fairly late in the war. He didn't actually start operations until 1944. So I think he probably had a slightly easier deal than a lot of aircrew flying in 1941, 42, 43. He took part in Operation Manor, dropping of food onto the Dutch civilians towards the end of the war, and a couple of other big raids, 1,000 bomber raids. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but yeah, quite a few notable ones. Yes, I think I'll write up one day.
That's something. Let's. I was going to. The reason I asked, my grandfather was 57 Squadron as a navigator
Okay.
on Lancaster. I've always started again, like kind of looking in, and yeah, it's also you just see these reports and it's like such and such, it's not returned, such not returned. You're like, oh, was it? It's a crew of guys. Like, oh my god, and that's every mission. So I just want to because there's this dropping food onto Dutch civilians that I think this is something that I only found out about myself very recently. Can you just talk people through that? Okay, I know we got on a lot of tangents here before the D-Day stuff, but these are all fascinating points. And I think I don't know if you've had the same experience. Always found the Dutch to be incredible when it comes to remembrance and stuff. And then when I heard about this operation and dropping the food, I thought, oh, well, there's another big reason why. So could you just give us a brief overview of what that operation was?
Yeah, so I mean, like you say, the Dutch are always very enthusiastic with commemoration. I try and go over to the Arnhem commemorations whenever I can, and I suppose Arnhem is the start of it. After the failed effort to cross the Rhine during Operation Market Garden, half of the Netherlands is sort of cut off, but the Allies are unable to penetrate it as the winter kicks in, and this is a period known as the Hunger Winter. The Dutch in northern Netherlands, Antwerp and down the coast, start to starve as supplies run out. The Germans ban all sort of imports of food as punishment for what happened during Market Garden. And yeah, there's starvation during the winter of 44-45. As the war is coming to a close in the spring of 45, the situation is so bad, and it's clear that the war is going to end soon, that the Allies negotiate with the Germans to allow free passage of supplies, food primarily, and medical supplies into the occupied areas of Dutch territory that the Germans still have control of. So there's lots of convoys, lorry convoys, and that sort of thing that drive into these areas. But as part of this, you also have two concurrent operations: Operation Manna for the RAF, so manna, the food from heaven, as in the Bible, and Operation Chowhound, conducted by the Americans. They're both one and the same thing, which is squadrons of Lancaster bombers or B-17 bombers for the 8th Air Force fly at very low altitude and drop massive parcels of food onto big open fields in various parts of the Netherlands. And if anyone has seen the Masters of the Air series, it's part of the last episode of that, dropping food supplies on. And yeah, it was very successful. There was concern, of course. The pilots that are flying over are worried, are the Germans going to fire on them? Which they didn't, fortunately. The Germans are worried, are they going to bomb them? Which they didn't, fortunately. And yeah, vast amounts of food are dropped into the Netherlands about, I can't remember the exact dates, was it 2 weeks or so before the armistice? And it's vital. It really does help save a population that is on the verge of starvation. And many people had succumbed over the winter because of this lack of food. So it was absolutely essential, really, to getting supplies into that part of the Netherlands that was largely cut off as a result of the operations in the autumn and then the spring 45.
Okay, let's rewind it to the summer of the previous year. So why Sword Beach?
So I'd been researching a number of landing crafts over the years, and I'd gained something as a reputation for knowing about landing craft. And one of the projects I did was LCT 7074, which is big landing craft now on display in Portsmouth outside the D-Day Story Museum. It was restored by the National Museum of the Royal Navy. It was sort of wrecked, flooded internally inside Birkenhead docks, and was salvaged by the National Museum of the Royal Navy, refloated, brought down to Portsmouth and restored to its D-Day appearance. And that I was recruited as the heritage advisor for that. So I'd become a bit of a landing craft nut by then. And there's not many of us in the UK who know as much about landing craft as that. And I get asked all the time by people if I can find out what their relative did on a particular landing craft on D-Day. And I can, because I know which records to look at in the National Archives. And if you if you give me a flotilla or a landing craft number, I can tell you what that landing craft did on D-Day. I can tell you who it loaded onto it, which troops it was carrying, when it loaded them, and where in the UK, what time it sailed, and where it was bound for on D-Day. And then, depending on the quality of the records, I can tell you what happened to it on D-Day as well. That's not always possible because not every landing craft is as well recorded as others. But I was researching one particular landing craft for another historian, John Henry Phillips, who's also an archaeologist, who was researching a particular landing craft, a landing craft headquarters 185, for a veteran who he was friends with. And he made a film about it and a book called No Roses on a Sailor's Grave. And during this research, I helped him find out what this landing craft did on D-Day. And it was around about now, because I've been researching landing craft for so long, that I was kind of thinking, why is it that there's no published works about the landing craft? Because a landing craft is the archetypal vessel of D-Day. There's all of these other ships. There's destroyers and battleships and troop transports and even submarines, the X-craft and that sort of thing. But really, D-Day is all about landing craft. That's the primary vessel type. And I thought, but there's nothing written about them. There's nothing published. And it surprised me because there's so much information in the archives. It's difficult to get to. You've got to consult 10 different sources. And so every time somebody asks me for something, I'd have to go and look at all of these sources and compile the information. But I started thinking, someday somebody's going to have to write something about what the landing craft do on D-Day. And so I started to get this idea in my head. Maybe I could write a book about, what every landing craft does on D-Day and what happens to it when it hits the beach. And I thought, there's 4,000 landing craft. I might have to do this one beach at a time. So I thought, okay, this is going to have to be, I'll do them beach by beach. And the landing craft I was researching for John Henry Phillips at the time was 185. It was one of the principal landing craft at Sword Beach. Okay, start at Sword. And Sword is somewhere I know quite well. It's somewhere like many people, I've always caught the ferry over to Ouistreham, and you arrive at Sword Beach. It has that close link with Pegasus Bridge that everyone knows. And I'd looked at Sword from a historical perspective many times before. And it's, I wouldn't say I have favorites or anything like that, but I was quite interested in Sword as a general area. So I thought, okay, we'll do this. And originally, all I was going to write about was the beach, just the strip of sand. And we'd follow the landing craft up to what they do and dropping the troops off, and maybe follow the troops as far as the inland road after they got off the beach. And I thought, just concentrate on that bit, that one single moment of an amphibious operation where the sea meets the sand and what happens in that instant. And I started, jotting down ideas and that sort of thing. But very early on, I thought, nah, I can't stop there, because what happens inland affects what happens back on the beach quite often. And it's hard to separate that. But then more importantly, I started looking around, and something sort of dawned on me, something that I had known but had never really consciously realized. There are no books about Sword Beach. There's a couple, the thin paperback books, the Battleground Europe series, the Osprey publication, which is half 6th Airborne, half Sword Beach, but they're like 70 pages. There's not a huge amount of detail. It's very much at a battalion level with simple facts. X battalion captured X objective at so many 100 hours. And they're very, very much overview. There was no detailed book about Sword Beach like there is for, say, Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach, there's hundreds of books where they describe individual people, individual paths off the bluffs and that sort of thing. You follow units in detail, and nobody had done that for Sword. And as I thought about this, I thought, well, that's nuts. Why hasn't that happened? This is D-Day, one of the biggest events in military history. Why has nobody tackled Sword Beach independently? And it's because it's always been swallowed by the greater story. The whole of D-Day always is such a big event that all the individual beaches can only have a certain amount of time put to them. But I thought, well, people write about Omaha all the time. Why can't we do Sword Beach? And so I started thinking along these lines, right, let's write a proper book about Sword. And that's where the idea came from. And and then started work on it.
Why do you think it is that beaches like Sword have been overlooked more, say, in comparison to Omaha?
It is this greater story thing. So when people write about D-Day, they either write about the Battle of Normandy and the landings and the 3-month campaign that follows it, or they write about D-Day and it's just the 6th of June. But either way, they write about all 5 beaches and the airborne landings as a whole. And that's a big thing. That's almost 10 divisions landing all at once. And it's hard then to give dedicated attention to any one beach. And then on top of that, you have Omaha, which is seen as the biggest and most significant beach. And that's debatable, if you ask me. Now, it does have the highest sacrifice. It has the highest number of casualties, at least 2,000, and at least 600 of those are fatalities. But it's also the biggest beach. So it's going to have that because of the area involved and the number of men landing on it. But the trouble is, and I think there is a certain amount of Hollywood to this, unfortunately, it gets all the attention. Quite early on in history, Cornelius Ryan writes about Omaha Beach far more than the other beaches. He dedicates something like 10 times more pages to Omaha than he does to Sword Beach. And that kickstarts, it's that 1950s. And then ever since, everyone has sort of rolled the same way. Omaha is the main beach. That's the one that people want to read about. So that's the one they give more attention to. And it's just an ever repeating cycle. And so beaches like Sword and Gold as well, because everything I've just said about Sword applies to Gold, they get less attention. And then there becomes a natural assumption that actually not much happened on them. And if you think about The Longest Day, Peter Lawford lands as Lord Lovett with the commandos. That's depicted as being the landing on Sword Beach. Lord Lovett actually comes ashore an hour and 20 minutes after the initial landing. So what happens in The Longest Day is actually somewhat realistic. There's not a huge amount of resistance for the commandos when they come ashore, relatively speaking. But that's because they land much later than the assault waves. But you get the impression from The Longest Day that Sword Beach is this sort of easier landing. There's not much resistance. The troops come ashore and start marching inland, and that's not really the case. And that's why I think it needed a book like mine to actually highlight that it wasn't just an easy casual landing at all. It was a resisted landing on the beach to the same level as Omaha was. There were just as many defenses on Sword Beach per mile as there were on Omaha Beach per mile, and just as many casualties per mile as well.
Yeah, I've come across this myself. Like I was going through a transcript yesterday with a soldier from 2 Oxen Bucks, and there's so much detail given to Pegasus Bridge, and then there was about 20 seconds of questions on the Operation Varsity, where the battalion lost almost half of its strength, and it's like, and you understand why, because it's like they've over the year, every year that Pegasus Bridge becomes the thing, still it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and all these other things kind of fall away. So I mean, that's why I do think it's brilliant that you've done this, because it's, if at some point, if nobody kind of stops that slide almost, it will almost be forgotten about, and it's almost seen as a sideshow in the end. Can you describe what Sword Beach, is in terms of whereabouts it is in the big picture, and what the terrain is? What are these landings coming into in terms of this, like on the terrain on the ground, and also the enemy forces on the ground?
So Sword Beach is the easternmost of the 5 landing areas. You've got Utah in the far west, and then you've got Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and then Sword. And Sword is a large sector. It's actually about 8 miles long, but the actual landing area where the troops came ashore, the designated actual assault area, is only 1 mile wide. That's Queen White and Queen Red beaches. So all of this is just outside of the town of Ouistreham. It's about a mile west of Ouistreham. Ouistreham, of course, is where the Caen Canal comes out to the open sea next to the Orne River. And you go about 4 miles inland from there, 3-4 miles, and you reach Pegasus Bridge. So Sword Beach sits between Juno Beach and the 6th Airborne landing area on the other side of the river and the canal. It's about 8 miles north of the city of Caen, and the beaches there are relatively flat. So it's unlike Omaha, where you have these steep sandy bluffs just behind the beach. We at Ouistreham and at Sword Beach is pretty flat going inland for the first couple of miles. So the beaches are quite wide. There's quite a wide tidal range there. At low tide, the beach is massive. At high tide, the water is coming almost up to the seawall. But once you get off the beach, it's flat terrain for the first 2-3 miles. And then there's a gentle gradient slope up onto the first ridge inland. And the top of that is probably about, by then you've probably got 3-4 miles inland. That's where strong points like Hillman are, which overlook the town of Colville, Montgomery. And then after that, you've got another series of low ridges and shallow valleys that lead to Caen. So it's pretty easy terrain compared to somewhere like Omaha, where you have those bluffs and slightly steeper slopes. But that, has its advantages. It also has its disadvantages. And then, of course, you've got the Caen Canal and the River Orne down the eastern side of it, so the left flank to the Allies as they're attacking and heading south, which the whole reason we wanted to capture Pegasus Bridge was to be able to link up the landings at Sword Beach with the 6th Airborne landings on the other side of the river and the canal. And Pegasus Bridge, like you're saying, it's sort of become the story of Sword Beach. Again, the longest day, because really all that's depicted of Sword Beach is Ludwig comes ashore with his commandos and then goes and relieves John Howard, Richard Todd, Bridges. And for a long time, I think that's primarily been Sword Beach's story. Troops get ashore, commandos advance, relieve Pegasus Bridge, sort of it. And there's so much more to tell, which is why I wanted to write the book.
So who are the British the British troops involved in making the landings? And you mentioned the commandos. Who else have we got kind of coming ashore at Sword?
So the primary assault formation is 3rd British Infantry Division. Now, they had fought in France in 1940. They were evacuated during the Dunkirk evacuation. At that point, after they got back to the UK, they were actually commanded by Montgomery before he went on to bigger and better things. By the time we get to 1944, they're led by Major General Rennie, Thomas Rennie, a Scot, who later fights later on in the campaign and is killed just towards the end of the war, in fact, with 50th Division. So they're the main assault formation. They are supported by 27th Armoured Brigade, so 3 regiments of Sherman tanks that are specially formed for the Normandy landings, and by 1st Special Service Brigade, Lovett's Commandos, which consists of 4 commando units plus attached units from 4 Special Service Brigade that are briefly under their command during the landings. And then you have other supporting formations as well. There's the Beach Groups, 101st Beach Group, who are there to make sense of the chaos of the landings and turn Sword Beach into a massive resupply area. They are being landed by Force S, a naval amphibious task force, which consists of numerous landing craft flotillas, troop ships. They're all under the command of Rear Admiral Talbot, who is the principal commander of 4S. They're also supported by Force D, which is the bombardment squadron with ships like HMS Warspite, HMS Ramillies, who are going to pound many of the gun batteries to the east of Sword Beach. And then you have the Royal Air Force as well. Now, the Royal Air Force, of course, their role is not limited to one beach. They cover pretty much the entirety of the landings, as a squadron can very easily move from one end of the landings to the other. But one of the main bombing groups involved, for instance, on the bombing of Ouistreham at 5 a.m. is Free Group RAF. And then you have numerous Royal Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force fighter bombers flying Typhoons and that sort of thing. The very last aerial attack on Sword Beach, on Strong Point Cod in the centre of Sword Beach, just before the landings, like minutes before the landings, is one of the Royal Canadian Air Force Typhoon squadrons who pound this strong point, and then that's the last sort of element of the bombardment before the troops actually touch the shore.
So I'd like to. Whoop, don't know why I've put my voice there. Obviously, getting excited about this stuff. So I want to go back to the bombardment, but before we go into that, you mentioned the specialist armor. Can we go into that a bit more about the kind of the Hobart's funnies and what was used and what the importance of them was?
So yeah, 79th Armored Division under Percy Hobart and Hobart's funnies. So there's so many different elements to Hobart's funnies and so many different units involved. So probably the most famous one are the swimming tanks, the DD tanks. Now, these are at Sword Beach. These are run by the 13th, 18th Royal Hussars, and they're not technically at this stage part of 79th Armored Division. They had been in the past, but now they're part of 27th Armored Brigade. So they're an independent squadron. Independent regiment, but two of their squadrons have been converted to DD tanks. Duplex drive tanks is the correct name. And these are the tanks that have a canvas skirt around the hull that can be inflated, so it erects alongside the hull of the tank and basically allows it to float. Just even though it's made of steel, by displacing sufficient water, the tank can actually be made to float. And then by attaching two propellers to the drive system and attaching them to the back of the tank, you can propel this tank through the water. And it sounds bonkers, and it is a bit, really, but it's a very interesting technique. I mean, the Germans had tried it in the early 40s as well, but they never followed it up. But it could be made to work. And this was tested in 43, 44 with Valentine tanks, and then they settled on Sherman as the best tank to do it with. So two squadrons of the three squadrons of the 13th, 18th Hussars were converted to DD tanks. And the plan was that they would launch 7,000 yards off the beach and swim into the beach with the assault infantry and the assault landing craft behind them. They would land about 7.5 minutes ahead of the first wave, and then they would park themselves in the breakwater, in this shallow water, and bombard targets on the beach at close range to support the landings of the troops and the other armor as they come ashore just a few minutes behind them. So in open water, these tanks could make about 4 knots, which isn't very fast. So they're going to be shuttled to, about 7,000 yards off the beach and then swim in independently. What actually happens on D-Day itself, Landing Craft Headquarters 185, which I mentioned earlier, it's the boat that John Henry Phillips was looking for. On board that is Commander Curry, and designated to him is the authority to decide where to launch these DD tanks. And he looks at the weather, he looks at the seas, and he looks at the opposition, the fact the Germans aren't responding to anything that's happening. And so he decides to get in closer. And so they launch the DD tanks at 5,000 yards, which gives them a bit of an advantage, gives them a bit more. They're a bit closer, so they should hopefully make a bit better speed. But there's still this rough weather left over from the storm that swept the channel the previous day that blows them off course a bit. It reduces their speed, and you've got these quite high waves, so they can only make about 3 knots. With the waves, I mean, these tanks only have a freeboard of about 1 foot, maybe 1.5 feet, and a couple of them are swamped by the waves. But worse, because they're going slower, the landing craft tank that are carrying the rest of the Hobart's funnies start to catch up with them. And so they all arrive at the beach at pretty much the same time. And a couple of the DD tanks are actually hit by the landing craft as they come inshore.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah. A couple of them are also hit by the landing craft rockets, these LCTs that have been converted to fire 1,000 rockets at the beach. And these are firing in banks of like 200 rockets at a time. Of course, they're all in close proximity. Several of them hit each other in the air. They fall straight down, and at least one hits a DD tank. So it's somewhat chaotic, as you might expect, with all of this ordnance and all of these vehicles and vessels all in the same place. The LCTs that catch up with the DD tanks, they carry the other Hobart's funnies. Now, these are a different unit altogether. These are Royal Engineers rather than an armoured formation. And they've got these Churchill tanks that have been converted to Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, or AVREs. And they have things like the bridge layer, or the fascine that can drop a huge bundle of timber into a trench so that vehicles can get across it. And they also have the Sherman Minesweeper flail tanks, or crab flail tanks, with the huge rotating drum in front of the tank with chains on it that spins rapidly, and the chains smash into the ground and hopefully detonate the mines on the beach. So although the DD tanks were meant to land 7.5 minutes ahead of all of these other ones, in fact, they all kind of get into the shore pretty much all at the same time. Which doesn't work out too badly. At least they all managed to get ashore. And on other beaches, Gold and Juno, the Royal Navy decided not to launch the DD tanks. So they took them in on their landing craft. And because of the scheduling and the organisation of the beaches, in many instances, the DD tanks get in late. Whereas at Sword Beach, they do manage to get ashore and support the landings, the initial first wave landings, which is crucial.
I just want to give some context to what 7,000 yards, according to my Google, is just under 4 miles, and 3 knots is basically a fast walking pace. Doing that in a tank in the fucking sea, oh my God. I mean, it's just that alone would have probably been someone's most horrendous ordeal of their life.
Yeah, I think so. And I couldn't find an exact time for the launching of the DD tanks, but from all of the available evidence, it looks like it was about 6:35, 6:40. By then, they've closed up to 5,000 yards from the beach. And so, yeah, 3 knots, that ties in with them getting ashore at the same time as everyone else at 7:26. And yeah, it must have been painstaking. And a couple of the veteran accounts say, progress was slow. I think they're fairly restrained in how they were feeling about it, and I know that some of them were having to bail out with their helmets and whatever they could because water was sloshing over the sides. And the idea of trying to swim a tank 5,000 yards in force-free weather by then, with landing craft behind you bearing down on you, rockets passing overhead and sometimes splashing down in the water around you, short shells from the bombardment smashing down into the sea, great geysers erupting around you, and then a massive smoke screen ahead of you on the beach where you know that basically there's a lot of firepower waiting for you to arrive. I mean, yeah, that's quite an enduring.
I mean, it's always worth at this point saying, when I read about D-Day, I don't know if there's ever been in human history the kind of the sensory overload that must have been those initial moments with these battleships, these aircraft, these vessels everywhere, like you said, fire coming in and out, and I'm not sure, like you read these battles of ancient battles and things, and yeah, they just sound intense and things, but they're almost in, they exist on one kind of plane, it's rather than all things coming from behind you, things coming from the sides of you, things over the top of you, and I just don't know if anyone else in human history is as well. I mean, other landings as well, but the D-Day landings, are something of their own kind of beast. And
yeah, I made a note in the forward part of my book and said, whilst reading this, try and imagine just a constant cacophony of noise and flashing and like you say, sensory overload. There's so much happening, bright flashes at the corner of your eye every second, and then right in front of you, constant, just the sound of Warspite's guns. By the time the troops get ashore, they'll have been 8 miles away from Warspite, but they'll still have been able to, you can hear gunfire from 8 miles away. But that was just the background noise to the destroyers that are only 2 miles behind you bombarding the beaches, plus the rockets, the tanks, the anti-tank guns, the engines, the aircraft screeching overhead. It must have just been unbelievably, shocking to the senses.
And then they probably would have been told that their hearing loss was not service related. Which is... So, okay, let me just flick back into questions. Sorry, I've lost my place a little bit here. So, what were these? What were the objectives then on Sword Beach? You mentioned kind of linking up with Pegasus Bridge, but for these troops coming ashore, before the commandos, what were their objectives to seize, in the area of Sword Beach?
So,
And we're sorry, and I should say as well, like obviously there's very granular objectives on this as well, but the broad strokes objectives.
so the biggest broad stroke objective, of course, is to secure a lodgement on the shore from which to conduct further operations. Parcel of that is to link up with the 6th Airborne Division on the eastern flank and make contact with the airborne forces at Pegasus Bridge to secure a connection, if you like, from the shore to the airborne forces. And on the right flank, on the western side, with the forces landing at Juneau. The ideal, and it is laid out in the orders for 3rd Division, is to secure Caen, which is 8 miles inland. Now, that's in the orders, and yes, it was an ambition. I don't think it was the be-all and end-all. And I kind of like to think of Caen as a stretch goal. If you can get it, great. But when you look at the orders that they were given, it's very much just try and get one brigade in there and hold it until it can be relieved. I don't think it was... I don't see Ford Sword as a failure because they didn't make it. Let's put it that way. Now, after that, of course, each brigade has its own objectives. 8th Infantry Brigade, who are the assault brigade, their objective is to secure the beach area, secure numerous strong points on the beach and a little bit further inland, and secure the high ground at Perrier Ridge, which is where Hillman is. 185 Brigade, the intermediate brigade, they're the ones who are tasked to then make a lightning advance on Caen and try and secure it. And then 9th Infantry Brigade, the reserve brigade, their mission is to support that and secure the flank of Caen prior to meeting up with the forces landing at Juneau. 1st Special Service Brigade, they have their own mission, and that is not to relieve the forces at Pegasus Bridge. It's to cross Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge and then move up to the Breville Ridge, where the Melville battery is, and secure the high ground overlooking the coast above Franceville Plage, and basically help secure the flanks of the airborne division's landings. 27th Armoured Brigade, their 3 regiments are separated between the 3 assault brigades. So 13th, 18th Hussars are supporting 8th Infantry Brigade, Staffordshire Yeomanry support 185th Infantry Brigade, and the East Riding Yeomanry support the 9th Infantry Brigade. And then the Beach Group, obviously, they have their own mission to secure the landing area and provide resupply over the beachheads for following advances. Because over the next couple of days, more forces are going to land at Sword Beach to continue that advance. So yeah, each unit, each brigade essentially had its own objectives as part of this greater plan. But the overall plan really is to secure the eastern end of the landings, support Juneau on one side, and help build up a front line with the 6th Airborne on the other side.
So what kind of casualties was the division, 3rd Division, expected to take during these landings? Did you come across any estimates of that kind of thing?
I don't think I came across any estimates. I heard lots of stories about how the 2 assault battalions were told they weren't expected to survive, which I think is more sort of gossip after the event than anything that was said beforehand. Casualties were expected to be heavy in the 2 assault waves. So the first 2 companies of each battalion landing on Queen Red and Queen Sword. There was analysis conducted of the casualties afterwards. So a battlefield study looked at what had happened on Sword Beach and all of the other beaches and the percentage of casualties taken on the beach by the assault wave, the intermediate wave, and so on, and then how many casualties they suffered inland. And they were high with the assault formations, but they were not enough to cripple the fighting efficiency of those units. In terms of the expected casualties, I think the expectation was that they would be able to absorb them. I don't think they were planning on writing off any of the battalions. Their their objectives beyond the beach pretty much show that. They were expected, certainly the 2nd East Yorks, who were landing on Queen Red as the assault battalion, their mission was to secure 2 strong points on the beach and then another 2 strong points inland before securing one of the villages. The South Lancs, they were landing on Queen White. They were supposed to secure another 2 strong points there and then a town as a jumping off point for 185 Brigade to move through them. The Suffolks, who were the 3rd Battalion in the assault brigade, so they're landing 40 minutes after the initial landings. Their objective was very much to move through the beach that has just been captured by the other 2 battalions, but then secure the Perrier Ridge so that 185 Brigade can pass through them. So they were all expected to make it off the beach and then secure further objectives. So I don't think any figures were put on this, at least I don't remember coming across any, but they were expected to be absorbable.
Yeah, that's very quite telling that they've almost got like 3 stages of objectives to take. I've actually made a mistake here as well, because I meant to come back to the bombardment and I just realized I forgot. So, audience, please forgive me that one. So in terms of the bombardment then, how successful was it? And you mentioned the RAF, mentioned the Navy, these rocket firing ships. Did it work?
Yeah, it worked for what it was supposed to do, but this is where a lot of people get confused because they think the bombardment was supposed to destroy all of the German defences, and they never were. So there's 2 types of bombardment. There's Force D, which has HMS Warspite, HMS Ramillies, HMS Roberts in it. They're not actually bombarding Sword Beach. They're bombarding targets to the east, the German coastal batteries with the big guns that can have a range of 10 miles. And their mission is very much to subdue those batteries. So the moment the German batteries start firing, the Royal Navy fires back. And the idea is to keep the gunners' heads down and neutralize those batteries until they can be destroyed at a later time. So they're attacked from the air, they're attacked by the Royal Navy battleships, and they're very successful. They have very good range finding. Their accuracy is good. They have spotter aircraft flying overhead for them, and they manage to keep those German strong coastal batteries subdued during the landing. So they aren't really able to engage the task force as it goes inshore. Then you also have the other bombardment, which is of Sword Beach itself. And this is carried out by a number of warships, principally by Royal Navy destroyers. 13 destroyers are allocated to bombard the beach, starting about 50 minutes before the landings. They park themselves about 3 miles off the coast in a line, essentially, with allocated berths. One of the destroyers doesn't make it. The Norwegian destroyer Svena is sunk by a torpedo. Just before this, 3 German torpedo boats, which are equivalent of destroyers, sneak out of Le Havre and manage to fire some torpedoes at the fleet, and only one actually manages to hit one of the Allied ships, and the Svena is sunk, unfortunately, with a loss of just under 40 lives. So they aren't able to take up their bombardment position, much to the captain's regret, because they never fire a shot during the battle, which Torholf was gutted by that. But the other 12 destroyers take up their berths 3 miles off the beach, and about 45 minutes before the landings, they open fire, and they have all been given an individual sector of beach. And I got all of this information from the task force orders, and so I mapped it out in my book, and it's one of the maps at the start that shows that allocated sector. And they were supposed to provide drenching fire across that part of the beach. They also had very specific details of individual strong points. So as well as that sector of beach they were allocated, they were also told of individual strong points and bunkers that they could target. But the idea is that they're just going to drench that piece of the shore with as much fire as possible. So it's fairly controlled fire because they have a finite supply of ammunition. Most of them expend at least half of their ammunition during that 45 minutes and then save the rest for bombardment duties during the rest of the day. So the destroyers are providing most of the firepower. But then there are other elements as well. As the task force advances, as the initial wave of landing craft advance, they're supported by converted landing craft tank. So the landing craft gun, which has two 4.7-inch guns installed on the tank deck. Because they're shallow draft vessels, they can get in really close and support the landings as the landing craft are going in. The landing craft rocket, which I mentioned, is 1,000 2-pound rockets on the deck, which can be launched in banks of 200 at a time. And they launch those about a mile off the beach, and screeching clouds of these rockets pass over the fleet and land on the landing area. Landing craft flak, which have been converted to carry all manner of flak, anti-aircraft guns, 2-pounders, 20mm Oerlikons, that sort of thing. They bombard the beaches as they get in closer. Landing craft support, which are smaller landing craft, again armed with artillery pieces, quite often Valentine tank turrets and that kind of thing. Then you also have support from the air. And at this point, about 20 minutes before the landings, the 8th Air Force, the American 8th Air Force, pass overhead with all of their B-17 bombers with specific targets to bomb. Now, this was controversial because they're being given tactical targets, individual bunkers and strong points. And the 8th Air Force, of course, for the last 3 years has been area bombing of cities and that sort of thing. And B-17s flying in box formations as they do aren't able to hit, tiny strong points. So one bomb group, one squadron is flying across an area, a mile wide of sky. So not all of their aircraft are going to hit a target. They were further hampered by cloud cover and by instructions that if there was cloud cover, they had to delay the release of their bombs so that they didn't hit any friendly targets. So the vast majority of their bombs miss. They all fall inland, so they don't contribute a huge amount. Again, Masters of the Air, the TV series that's been on Apple TV recently, 100th Bomb Group is the focus of that program. They bomb Ouistreham on Sword Beach on D-Day. And I've got several accounts from their aircrew as to what happened when they flew overhead in the book. So you've got the destroyers, the converted landing craft. You have a couple of cruisers hitting some of the strong points a little bit further inland all at the same time. Then the landing craft rocket and landing craft gun come down the flanks of the invasion force. They start pounding the beaches as they get in close enough. And then the coup de grace, if you like, is the final attack on the strong point right in the middle of Sword Beach, Strong Point Cod, which is carried out by 440 Royal Canadian Air Force Squadron, I think, with Typhoons, and they drop 500-pound bombs on this strong point just at the last minute, just as the landing craft are getting up to the beach. And then 2-3 minutes before the landings, the bombardment stops. One Royal Navy officer, Philip Barber, he recounts the silence was as terrifying as the bombardment itself, because suddenly and I can imagine it must have been quite an eerie silence, like the end of a fireworks display, suddenly settles over the beach, just the echoes fading off of the remains of the bombardment, and just a huge amount of cloud and dust on the beach. That must have been quite nerve-wracking, just as the landing craft are getting into the shore. But the idea behind it was to subdue the defences. There was never any expectation it would, destroy every German defence. The accuracy isn't there. The idea was to bombard these places and keep the German gunners' heads down so that they're in their personnel shelters, they're hiding from the blasts rather than manning their guns and trying to lay their guns on the fleet as it approaches. And in that sense, it was incredibly successful, because the German defenders don't open up onto the invasion force until, the last 500 meters, which is brilliant, really, from the Royal Navy's point of view. They managed to preserve the fleet almost until touchdown. But it doesn't destroy the defences. And in fact, when an observation party studied Sword Beach and the other beaches a couple of days after the landing, they tried to work out what had destroyed each individual defence, and the bombardment had not done much. They'd knocked out a couple of machine gun posts, they'd probably damaged one or two of the 50mm anti-tank guns, but the main defences, the big bunkers and the 75mm anti-tank guns, they were pretty much intact. But that was sort of to be expected, because this is very thick concrete. It would take a very lucky direct hit to knock him out by a very big gun. And yeah, the accuracy just wasn't there.
The amount of coordination that's involved in this is simply mind blowing. It makes me. I mean, it's a stupid example. I think. Why can't we get the trains to run on time? we think about this, and it's. I guess that's war, isn't it? When the stakes are so high and you've got so many people and brilliant minds pulled from all different walks of life where they wouldn't usually be put in the military. But that the coordination of it is simply staggering.
Yeah.
And really maybe something is kind of got overlooked because quite rightly we remember the guys landing on the beaches, but these people who never they never get over to Normandy, they were putting all of this stuff together. It's just incredible what they pulled off. You mentioned the loss of the Svenna. Did that then have an effect for the troops that landed in that area not having the support of that destroyer?
Actually, no, because Svenna's target was over on the other side of the Orne River. She was meant to be bombarding Franceville, Plage, and that sort of area. So, in terms of the effect of the bombardment, it had a minimal effect, fortunately. It did have a bit of an effect on some of the troops, though, because Svenna sank in the lowering area, which is the sort of offshore anchorage where all the troop ships lower their smaller landing craft into the water. And when she was hit by this lucky shot from a torpedo, she broke in half. The torpedo hit slap bang amidships in the boiler room, and the destroyer broke in half and sank in the middle, with the bow and the stern both pointing up in the air. One commando said it looked like a folded pocket knife as it lifted out and closed. And to many people, they remember it as this sort of macabre V for victory floating in the water. But for many of the troops, they saw that, and then they knew it was the real deal. And, this is proper combat, and we're at war. So it left a profound effect, I think, on many of the troops that went past it. And, lots and lots of people saw it. So it was their first taste, if you like, of the action that was coming.
And is she still there?
There's a lot of wrecks off the Normandy beaches. Most of them were flattened with explosives after the war because they're a hazard to navigation. Only where the Svenna is not far off the route taken by the ferry from Portsmouth to Weestrum every day. So, but you have so many ships operating in that area coming out of Le Havre and Weestrum in the modern day. Any wreck on the seabed is a hazard to navigation. So most of them were flattened with explosives in the late 40s. So the wreckage is still there. And in fact, only about 15, 20 years ago, the anchor from Svenna was recovered and is now next to the memorial on Sword Beach to the Svenna. So there's stuff down there, but it's not a complete wreck anymore. It's been even further battered.
I mean, I imagine that was probably quite a difficult thing to do, flattening them, because presumably it would be a war grave site.
Yeah, war graves are difficult things to define. At sea, there is no automatic recognition of a vessel as a war grave. It has to be a Yeah, and there's the Protection of Military Remains Act in Britain, of which there's two types. But there are hundreds, thousands of wrecks from wartime all around the coast of England, and only 200 or so are protected spots. Well, I worked on a project when I worked for Maritime Archaeology Trust called Forgotten Wrecks of the First World War. And we were researching all of the wrecks in the English Channel from Dover down to the Isles of Scilly and halfway into the English Channel, so sort of halfway to France, that were associated with the First World War from 1914 to 1918. And the plan was to catalogue all of these wrecks. How many do you think there might have been?
Oh, God, I have no idea, mate.
1,100. Just from 1915 to 1918. Yeah. There are long guesses of thousands of wrecks in the Channel, and that's just First World War. And I mean, 24 of those are actually protected, but a lot of them are graves. That's where people, their last remains are. So it's not an easy business thinking about that sort of thing. Most of this flattening of the wrecks was done in the immediate post-war period. So there was less consideration given to it at the time. But yeah, there's still a problem today. You look at the wrecks out in the Far East that are being salvaged for their steel by agencies unknown. I think we all know who it is, but they're salvaging wrecks like HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Repulse, the Java Sea wrecks. Half of those wrecks have disappeared because they've just been lifted from the seabed for scrap metal, along with the remains that would have been on board.
God, I had no idea that was happening.
Oh, I'll do another podcast for you if you want. All right, there's other people far more involved than I am, but yeah. So the Java Sea wrecks from 1942, the Battle of the Java Sea, HMS Exeter, the Dutch destroyer Java, American wrecks as well. There's 3 nationalities of Allied wrecks plus the Japanese wrecks. They're all being ripped up from the seabed by floating barges with huge mechanical cranes to get the steel to sell for scrap.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's not very pleasant.
Oh, that's lovely thought for the day. Okay, so that's yeah. No, mate, that's it's shocking. I mean, it's not shocking when you think about it, but yeah. Okay, so back to D-Day. Can you talk us through what happens when the infantry hit the beach?
So the timings for the landing are 7:25 in the morning. The DD tanks should have landed 7.5 minutes ahead of that, according to the precise schedule. But pretty much, they get overtaken by the big landing craft tank with Hobart's funnies on the assault Royal Engineers. And the very first one of those, LCT 796, I think, touches the beach, according to the flotilla commander, at 7:26 in the morning. So that's pretty good going, I would say. They all arrive in a big mess of landing craft, if you like. So there's 10 LCT landing across the mile of the beach. There's about 40 landing craft assault. There's small infantry carrying landing craft of the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy's equivalent of the Higgins boat. And by the time they get to the beach, there's about 32 surviving Sherman DD tanks. And yeah, over the next 5 to 10 minutes, all of these vessels hit the beach. Obviously, they drop their ramps. One of the first things they notice is that the beach obstacles that they're supposed to be landing in front of, the beach obstacles should still be dry on the dry beach ahead of them. The tide is coming in much faster, and so those beach obstacles are already starting to be immersed. And so many of the troops land amongst these beach obstacles. The landing craft tank, they drop their ramps, and the first vehicles to disembark are the Sherman crab flails. So they drive off the ramp, and the idea, of course, is that they're going to drive straight up the beach with their flails rotating to detonate mines and clear a path up to the top of the beach. So it's them that come in for the first sort of shots of shell fire. On 796, which is the flotilla commander vessel, and also has the commander of the Royal Engineers on board, Commander Cox. The first tank to get off actually gets off okay and heads up the beach, but then the second tank is hit by something, most likely an anti-tank gun from Strongpoint Cod. It could have been something else, but just as it's on the ramp, it is hit and disabled. And then all of these other tanks, the Churchill tanks of the Royal Engineers, are stuck behind it. And this landing craft actually comes in for quite a pounding from, again, enemy fire. Some people thought it was mortars. Some people thought the anti-tank guns. It's hard to know for sure now, but it gets hit multiple times. And the tanks on board are struck, and Colonel Cox is killed when one of the explosive charges attached to the tanks explodes, and he's killed. They never managed to get off their off their landing craft, but eventually that landing craft sails back to the UK with all of these tanks still trapped on board because they can't get this blown up Sherman off the ramp at the front. The infantry, they run into a hail of machine gun fire depending on where they've touched down. So on the far western end of the landings, Lieutenant Jones with the South Lancashires, he manages to get most of his platoon up to the top of the beach, unaffected. So there's a couple of injuries and casualties, but most of the platoon makes it as a complete formation because there's not that many defences at that end. it is, for want of a better word, a slightly quieter part of the beach. And once they get off the beach and break into some of the houses, they find the German defenders are actually Eastern Europeans hiding in the basement. So the resistance there isn't strong. But that's one bit of the beach. If you go to another bit of the beach, in front of Strongpoint Cod, which is this big German strong point, Widerstrandelnest 20. This is the biggest single German strong point on all 5 beaches. So it has several anti-tank guns, several anti-personnel shelters, mortar pits, machine gun posts, and a network of trenches, all surrounded by barbed wire. And it's the strong point HQ, if you like, of the platoon that is defending Sword Beach from the 716th German Infantry Regiment. That is a much tougher nut to crack, and there's very heavy machine gun fire coming from there, which kills many of the men as they try and get up the beach, weaving their way between the obstacles. The objective for all of these men is to get to the top of the sand, where there's a sort of dune wall, if you like. It's about, a meter to 2 meters high in places. So there's this whole dune complex up at the top of the sand that the men have to overcome. And this is very strongly reinforced with barbed wire and that sort of thing. So the men need to be able to get through that. And of course, they brought Bangalore torpedoes with them to achieve that, which they can slide under the barbed wire and then detonate and create a path so that they can then get off the sand and into the houses and the back roads immediately behind the beach. And they take many casualties doing that. Of course, the main objective for these assault companies is to overcome Strongpoint Cod, and so they're trying to get into it from the flanks, so get in off the beach and then attack it from the sides. But there's very heavy machine gun fire coming along the beach, enfilade fire, firing along the length of the beach from these strong points, Cod in the middle, and then Skate to the eastern side. Not so much stuff to the west, but all of the houses that survive along the waterfront that the Germans haven't demolished have all been turned into strong points as well. So you have infantry in these houses that are able to shoot down on the beach. You've seen the first 30 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, I'm sure, and I think most people have. And everyone tends to think of that as very much the scene on Omaha. But like I said earlier, Omaha Beach has the highest number of casualties because it's the longest beach. It's 3.5 miles wide. Sword Beach is only 1 mile wide. But if you take the average number of defences per mile on Omaha Beach, it's the same as Sword Beach. The density of defences is the same, and so are the number of casualties. So although Sword Beach looks very different geographically, there's no cliffs or bluffs at Sword Beach. The fighting, certainly along at least half of it on Queen Red Beach, would have been just as intense as you see, or as you might imagine in Saving Private Ryan. And I'm always careful of referencing a film. It is a film. So what you see in Saving Private Ryan gives you an idea of the intensity of combat that isn't necessarily exactly what happened on Omaha Beach. But if you think of the bloody Omaha story, it applies on Sword Beach as well. There is no beach that was easy. If any beach could be described as easy, it would be Utah. But even that wasn't a walkover. So, yeah, there was very intense fire, machine gun fire primarily, mortar fire from immediately behind the beach. But also, this section of beach had been pre-targeted by the German bombardment areas. The German bombardment batteries just inland. Strongpoint Morris and Strongpoint Hillman. Hillman? Yeah, no. Oh, I forgot the name of it anyway. One of the other German strongpoints. So they were just given the signal, please target X sector, Y sector. So there was artillery fire coming down on the beach as well. So yeah, it was very heavy combat, at least for those first 30 minutes.
So I suppose the question would be, how the hell do you get off that beach? What were there notable actions by either individuals or units that were able to get
Yeah, there were. So over where Lieutenant Jones has come ashore at the far eastern end of the landings, and he comes ashore at exit 11, which is where all the memorials to Sword Beach are now, the Svena Memorial, the 3rd Infantry Division Memorial. He gets up to the top of the beach. He's confronted by this wall of barbed wire, and he realizes that his platoon has already lost their Bangalore torpedo. It's somewhere out in the sea. And so he's a bit stuck. But eventually he's rescued by the Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, who drive their tanks straight through the barbed wire and clear a path for them. And so in that way, they're able to clear the beach. Over at the far western end, the far eastern end, Lieutenant Rutherford of the 2nd East Yorks, he is probably the landing craft that lands the furthest east on the assault landings, and so he's got nothing to his left. You can only see stuff happening on his right. He has a platoon of 30 men. They rush up the beach amongst the obstacles, clear the sand, and they get up to the dunes at the top. But they're caught by machine gun fire that's sweeping down the beach from Strong Point Skate, about 500 meters to their left, or less, perhaps. Probably less. His platoon sergeant is killed next to him as he goes to grab a Bren gun. He manages to grab a Bren gun and sort of return fire. He looks around for his mortarman to lay smoke to sort of protect their left side, but he's vanished. He's never seen again, and unfortunately lost. Eventually, they managed to get a Bangalore torpedo underneath the barbed wire. They clear a path, and through that, they managed to get off the beach and onto the road immediately behind. But of the 30 men who got off the landing craft with him, less than half get off the beach. The rest are killed or wounded on the sand. Fortunately, not all killed, but most are incapacitated. By the end of the day, I think he's got 10 men left. So they take very heavy casualties. There is another incident with the South Lancs A Company, and A Company's commander, Major, I forgot what his name, Major Howard, I think. I've got a book here in front of me that gives me the answers. I can remember his name. He was the company commander for A Company. Yeah, John Howard. It's handy having a book that I can reference. John Howard is, A Company commander. He lands with 9 platoon, but much further east of 8 and 9 platoons where Lieutenant Jones has come ashore. So he lands almost in the middle of Sword Beach, with Strong Point Cod close in front of him. And he watches as his platoon goes up to the cliff at the sand dunes at the top of the beach. And they put together a Bangalore torpedo, slide it under the barbed wire, and he sees a man prime it. They all duck for cover, and then nothing happens. So the charge misfires. So Howard himself then rushes up to try and fix it. He's hit by a burst of machine gun fire as he does so, and collapses. But then his men watch as he drags himself over to the charge, resets it, and detonates it. And he makes no effort to clear the area as that goes off. And one of his men, with the path now clear with the barbed wire done, one of his men goes up to check on him, and Harwood says to him, "Carry on, I'll catch up with you later." Of course, he doesn't. He succumbs to his wounds later that night. But yeah, through his action, he managed to clear a path. Another man is...
No, sorry to interrupt, mate, but what was he... Presumably, he was awarded something for that. I don't believe it was a VC. But what was there an award that he was...
I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm not sure he did.
Really? Because there was only one VC given to the British on D-Day, right?
And it was on Gold.
And it wasn't it wasn't for that action, which is kind of staggering when you hear that story.
I'm not aware that he was awarded anything, and really? There's only so many posthumous awards you can get, and I think it's just the VC or the mention in dispatches. So I'm not sure that he could have got anything because he died. I can't remember the exact criteria for decorations, but no, I'm not aware that he received anything. And there are other men as well. So one of the platoon commanders of the second wave of the South Lancs, I think it was, to come ashore, then has to take command of his company. He leads an attack on one of the flanks of Strongpoint Cod, shoves his Sten gun through the embrasure of a pillbox and machine guns everyone inside, then shoves a grenade through. And just as he's secured that objective, he gets hit by a burst of machine gun fire and killed, which infuriates his men, who then charge and take the position. So a bit like on Omaha Beach, there's lots of individual actions by individual groups of men in clearing certain strong points to actually free up space for the rest of the men to move off the beach. But yeah, it's very much, despite the small size of Sword Beach, only 1 mile wide, I think when the men come ashore, they're all very quickly engrossed in their own little actions against individual targets, rather than feeling the full weight of a huge force. Jones, Lieutenant Jones of 8 Platoon, who lands right at the far western end, he only has one other LCA next to him from 7 Platoon and a couple of the landing craft tank. He feels very much like he's on his own for quite a while, because he can't really see anything. His company commander, Howard, who I just mentioned, he's 500 meters down the beach, and that's a long way when you're in a combat setting. And so I think everyone gets involved in their own little engagement until they get off the beach and they can link back up again with the rest of their battalion.
Did you come across anything about Bangor King with the East?
Yes. Oh, yes, I did.
Can I have some Bangor King stories, please? Because he's something of a hero.
He is a hero. And there's a wonderful gentleman who did living history for him at Chalk Valley and at the We Have Waves Festival last year, who I chatted with extensively, and he's a great guy. And I forgot his name, and that's so embarrassing, though.
I'll find him now, because I'm familiar with who you mean. You keep going, mate.
So Bangor King, I found some correspondence that he wrote to the wife of his Batman, Private Blenkhorn, which gave me a little bit of insight into what happened. And there are a couple of witnesses to his actions and that sort of thing. He lands with A Company right in front of Strongpoint Cod, and their objective is to secure Cod. And Blinkhorn remembers that as Bangor got off the landing craft, he was first off, runs up the beach, shouts at his men to charge. He's very much leading from the front and shouting at them to keep moving and not get pinned down before leading them into the strong point itself. And I think I could work out roughly which bits of the strong point they attacked. There was just enough information to go on. But of course, the trouble is that Bangor King passes away. He's killed just towards the end of the war. I mean, his memoirs would have made fantastic reading had he survived. And, his actions, of course, go far beyond D-Day, numerous engagements right up until April 1945 when he's killed. Just a phenomenal character. And he was much loved in the 2nd East Yorks. Everyone knew who he was and respected him. He's the person who read passages from Shakespeare on their troop ship just as they were disembarking onto their landing craft assault from Henry V, which I include in the book. And yes, so many people remember that, even people who weren't in his company. He gets in the book. You couldn't write Sword Beach without having Bangor King in it. He is one of the principal figures. But it's a shame that I didn't have his own. Well, I had these letters that he'd written to the wife of his Batman, but a memoir would have been so wonderful to have.
Yeah, just on that one, on the reenactor, I can't find his name. It just says History Maker. So I'll just put a link for that for people down in the show notes so they can check that out. But yeah, it's archaeologist.
I don't worry, mate. We'll have a lot of foreign people listening to this. I came across Banger's story, during like the Rhineland campaign, and the battle that he was killed in as well was really their last real pitched battle of the war as well. With
Adam Shoot de Forges. That's his name, yeah. And he wrote it at Chalk Valley this year, and no doubt we have Waves Festival. And yes, everyone should go and check out his reenacting his living history, because it is absolutely phenomenal. And the job he did on Banger was incredible.
Mm-hmm. And the Henry V speech as well. That would be the Band of Brothers speech, as we get out.
So yeah, there's several people who remembered it and gave passages from it. The official history of the 3rd Infantry Division does include a passage as well, although I'm not sure if they included the bit they thought was most appropriate or if it's the bit that he actually said. But without a doubt, from all of the reminiscences from what people had recorded, it's definitely the speech before the battle of that one. The big battle, the end of Henry V, and I forgot the name of it. It's medieval, I forget.
State Crispin's Day speech, is that what's known as?
That's the one, yeah.
So now that they're ashore, these kind of first waves. It's what's the kind of the commando landings? What's their role in all of this?
Commandos land in 3 waves. The very first commandos to touch the beach are the 177 French commandos from 10 Troop Inter-Allied Commando. And they've been attached to 4 Commando for the landings. And basically they're coming from 2 different groups of vessels. The French commandos come from some big, what's called landing craft infantry, small. And the 4 Commando troops, they've come off a troop ship and they're landing through landing craft assault. And it just so happens that the French vessels get to the beach first. This is about half an hour after the initial landings. So half an hour after the East Yorks and South Lancs have touched down. And the French commandos come ashore in these 2 landing craft. It's a bit chaotic because one of the landing craft is hit as it hits the beach. Its ramps can't deploy. It takes a while to get the men off. The other landing craft is more successful. The French commandos disembark, and then that landing craft moves over to the damaged landing craft and helps get their men ashore. A minute or 2 later, all of the landing craft assault carrying 4 Commando touch down on either side of these landing craft. And so the whole of 4 Commando with these French commandos attached storms up the beach. This is all happening at the far eastern end of the beach. This is where Lieutenant Rutherford, who I mentioned earlier, loses 2/3 of his men, had touched down about half an hour earlier. They come under very heavy fire from this German strongpoint on the east end of Sword Beach, strongpoint Skate, or Wiedelstrandel-Nest number 18. The bunker from this strongpoint still survives today. It's been converted into part of somebody's house, but it's very easy to see the position it had looking down the beach and how it would have easily had an impact on the troops coming ashore. Now, the anti-tank gun had been knocked out by Hobart's Funnies, in fact, by one of the Sherman Crabs. They've managed to neutralize the gun, but there's still machine gun positions and mortars that can engage the defenders. Commandos were a bit peeved by this because their expectation was that the 2nd East Yorks would have knocked out this strong point. What they don't realize is that the follow-up 2 companies of the 2nd East Yorks have been delayed. So only the first 2 companies have been put ashore, and only 1 company has come ashore anywhere near where the commandos are landing, and they've been very heavily decimated, and they're now trying to attack Strongpoint Cod. The second 2 companies are delayed, and they actually land behind 4 Commando. So there's a lot of criticism from 4 Commando about the 2nd East Yorks and say, they didn't do their objectives. That's because they were late. They didn't make it in time to actually assault this strong point. So 4 Commando have to attack Skate by themselves, which they do. And there's another very notable action by an individual, Lieutenant Carr, who is the commander of the support troop in 4 Commando. There's a machine gun position that's holding up the men at the barbed wire, and this commander sneaks under the barbed wire, and then in what's described as a classic bowling fashion, as if he's bowling for cricket, throws a grenade that lands directly into this German machine gun post and kills everyone inside. And that opens up a path then of clear sand for the men to start advancing inland. They do take quite heavy casualties from mortar fire and from this strong point for Commando and the French commandos, but not enough to affect their fighting formation. They form up just behind the beach, just behind this strong point. Their mission now is to go east into Weestrum and attack one of the German coastal batteries, strong point number 8, codenamed Bass by the British, which is a coastal artillery battery with 115 millimeter guns, which had been bombarded, had been bombed by the Royal Air Force, had been attacked by the battleships in an attempt to neutralize it. But of course, the only way you can be certain that a coastal battery is neutralized is to send troops in. So that's why they're the first of the commandos ashore. They break off. They're not led by Lovett. They go off and attack Weestrum by themselves. About half an hour after that,
just before you go to that point, I just want to tell people as well, when you're saying this stuff, I'm following along on the maps in your books, which I think we talked about before we record. These maps are fantastic. So, I just wanted to kind of get that in there as well, because as you're saying this, I'm just following along on these maps, which are just.
Well, that's how I wrote the book. Yeah, as I went through all of these records. So for like the following Battle of Weestrum, 4 commandos attack on Weestrum, I could rely on the war diary from the commando itself. I found numerous memoirs of members of 4 commando. McDougall, for instance, who's one of the subsection commanders. I found some of the private papers of some of the commanders as well, and of the commandos, unpublished accounts that are in places like the Imperial War Museum or the National Army Museum. And I compiled all of this. Commander Kiefer, the commander of the French troops, his memoir and his report that he wrote about a week after D-Day. And so I took all of this information and then I combined it with the intelligence maps that they'd been issued with before D-Day to work out what they're doing. I found their operational plan and the route they were intending to take into Weestrum. Aerial photographs where I could see the tanks that were taking part in this attack on Weestrum are actually visible on some of the roads, so I know where they went. And this whole thing was filmed by a member of the Army Film and Photographic Unit as well. So there's footage and photos from this attack. And as I was doing all of this, I plotted it out on maps. So, I used Google Maps just to pinpoint individual bits and drew a map, if you like, a digital map of what's happening so I could reference everything and frame it in its correct place. And so when it came to, putting the book together in its final stages, I had all of that information to create these maps. And I thought, well, I know this is accurate. So I put it together so that it was easy to put maps together to put in the book. And yeah, it helped me immensely in writing the book. And I knew it would help people when they come to read it to visualize what's happening on the ground. And if they want to go back and walk the ground as well.
I mean, I'll certainly be using it for that, but it's a masterpiece of detective work, mate. So to be fair, it really is. So sorry, I just wanted to get that in there because it's just fantastic watching this. Because the first thing I did when I looked at these maps, I thought I'll go back here and walk in these bits. So I'm sorry, mate, I interrupted you. We were going through Weestrum.
Yeah. So 4 Commando head off into Weestrum. And they follow the Avenue de Lyon-sur-Mer into Weestrum, and then they turn north to attack these objectives from behind. And this is where the famous French commando attack on the casino comes from, because if you've seen The Longest Day, you've seen them attack a casino, which looks like a big ornate gambling casino. The real casino in Weestrum had been demolished by the Germans and turned into a sort of strong point, just keeping the concrete bottom ground floor and reinforcing that, putting anti-aircraft guns on the roof and that sort of thing. And 4 Commando allocated that particular strong point to the French to attack, which they did. So they fight their own little action against this strong point, neutralizing it and securing it before withdrawing, whilst the rest of 4 Commando attacks the coastal battery. And it's a really interesting action because there's so many parallels with what happens at Pont de Hoc, which is very famous for the ranger attack, climbing the cliffs and that sort of thing. The difference is at Weestrum, there's no cliffs, but what you do have, Weestrum is essentially the only place of urban combat on D-Day. So there's fighting in villages, San Meriglise, perhaps probably the largest place along the rest of the Normandy beaches. But, San Meriglise is very small. It's not really an urban environment. It's a couple of streets of houses. Well, certainly back then it was. Weestrum is a sprawling town and a port, and so it's a much bigger kettle of fish. This is one reason why 4 Commando, unlike the rest of the Commando units, they wore their steel helmets rather than their berets. And they make an attack through an urban environment, set-piece attack on this German coastal battery. And then just like Pont de Hoc, they break into the battery, they go to neutralize or spike the guns, and they're not there. The guns have been pulled back by the Germans whilst they built new shelters for them, just like in Pont de Hoc. And you get the same story essentially as you have at Pont de Hoc, but it's just not as well known. Nobody's ever written about Weestrum as a set-piece battle. There's loads of books about Pont de Hoc. And so that's why I sort of coined the phrase for it in the book, the Battle of Weestrum, because it's a big event in its own right. And by combining all of these accounts, like you say, it's a piece of detective work. I was able to work out what they did, where they went, how they did at the times, and that sort of thing. And there's more than enough accounts of the men who were there to add to it as well.
No, I mean, just looking at the map now, for one, because a commando essentially a kind of battalion size.
Yes. I mean, that's right.
It's a massive, massive amount of buildings and areas to cover.
Yeah.
So we don't need to go into every one. So if maybe we just pick on kind of Hillman as an example of what happened kind of later in the day, because, I think D-Day, we quite often think of the beach and then, that kind of, they're on the beach and that's kind of where the coverage and things stop. So what, could you talk us through like what would be using Hillman as an example of the kind of things that were then going on kind of later on with these strong points needing to be taken further inland?
Yeah, so Sword area, not just the beach, but the area between Sword Beach and Caen is one of the most heavily defended parts of the Normandy area, landing areas. There's nowhere else really where you get so many German defenses so far inland, except perhaps Utah, where you have coastal batteries running up towards Cherbourg. At Sword, you have all of these strong points like Hillman, several miles in from the beach. Juno and Gold and Omar, you don't have that. You get the crust, if you like, the beaches themselves, but after that, there's not that many German strong points to overcome. But at Sword, these had to be overcome because several of them were artillery batteries that could fire on the beach, so they needed to be neutralized. And several of them were command posts that basically were sited to prevent easy access further inland. And Hillman is the most notable of those. So it sits on the Perrier Ridge, just behind the town of Colville-sur-Orne, as it was. Now it's Colville-Montgomery. On the high ground overlooking the beach. It had a commanding view east and west. And it was realized that this could basically upset any attempted advance across that ridge. Now, the Allies thought it was a battalion HQ. They didn't realize it was actually a brigade HQ. And the commander of 736 Grenadier Regiment, Oberst Krug, who was the main defender of this sector of the landing areas. They didn't realize quite how well reinforced it was either. So thinking it was a battalion strong point, they thought there were bunkers. They didn't realize that there were steel cupolas on some of these bunkers, which gave you a reinforced firing point that was very, very hard to neutralize. Found of 3 of them at Hillman. Now, this is an objective for the Suffolk Regiment. They are the support battalion of the assault wave of 8 brigades. So they land 40 minutes after the first landings, and they're intended to advance straight through and overcome several objectives. In fact, Morris, which is one of the artillery strong points, just outside Colville, Colville itself, and then Hillman on the top of the hill. They come ashore in good order with very, very few casualties. Although they do suffer one, most notably, which is their bombardment liaison officer, who is in contact with the warships offshore. So with his death, it's impossible for them to call on Royal Navy fire support, which is problematic later. They advance inland into the woods, very close to where Hermanville Cemetery is now. The Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery just outside Hermanville. And then across country, supported by C Squadron and the 13th, 18th Hussars. So this is one of the squadrons that lands regularly from landing craft. They're not DD tanks. It's the final squadron. And they are tasked to support the Suffolks. They move across fields, the British quickly realizing that if they stick to the fields of Cowes in, then they're almost guaranteed to not hit any mines, because you wouldn't release a herd of cattle into a minefield. So, and so they make it intact to the northern fringes of Colville. They need to clear Colville, and this is something that the Suffolks have actually been training for months. They've organised their platoons and companies very specifically into house clearing companies, and then breaching platoons that will assist in the attacks on the two German strongpoints they have to attack. So they sweep through Colville. Fortunately, find most of it is unoccupied. There's most of the Germans who were there have pulled out. There was an engagement on the north side of Colville, just ahead of them. That was actually the commandos cleared out strongpoint 19 and routed the German defenders there. And they withdraw to another strongpoint further to the east. So the Suffolks don't get too involved in that. They come to attack Morris, which is this group of artillery bunkers, and they are ready for a sort of set-piece assault, if you like, with their breaching platoon, one of their breaching platoons, leading the way for one of the companies to then exploit and pass through. They realise there's not much resistance, and so they change the order of things. They think, well, we'll clear a path through the minefields first, whilst the Germans don't seem to be observing us, then call down an artillery strike from the self-propelled artillery that's just coming ashore, and then assault the position. And just as they're about to launch all of this, a white flag pops up from one of the bunkers, and all of the Germans inside surrender. They'd been hit very heavily by warship fire before the landings, and they didn't have the stomach for the fight. So Morris is overcome easily, but I wouldn't say quickly. It still takes time for them to get there. Bear in mind, they're landing at just after 8 o'clock, 8:15. It takes a while to form up and to make all of these advances. And now they have to clear the rest of Colville. They eventually do, and then they get into a position where they can observe Hillman. And this is where they realise that Hillman is a much, much tougher nut to crack than they had originally anticipated. They make their first assault at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which is a little bit late. It's a bit behind schedule. And some people have criticised them for that and wondered why they took so long to get off the beach. When you consider they had to clear a village or a town and make this attack on Morris, the artillery strong point, as well, I think they did pretty well to be making an attack at 1 o'clock. Now, this attack is repulsed quite quickly because there's only one way to attack the strong point, and that's from the north, and they're coming at it from below as well. So the Germans have the advantage of height, and they, having these armoured cupolas, they have machine gun posts inside them that can very easily bring down fire on the infantry. Despite laying smoke screens, whilst engineers clear a path through the mines and the barbed wire, the infantry that can get inside the strong point are very quickly held up. And after an hour or so, they're forced to withdraw again. And Lieutenant Colonel Godinson then starts to contemplate how else they can get into this. He realizes that the only way they're going to overpower this strong point is with armor, and they need Sherman tanks. So he instructs Captain Heal of the Royal Engineers to start clearing a minefield a passage through the minefield wide enough for tanks, whilst they wait for some flail tanks to come up. Fortunately, he instructs Heal to clear this minefield by hand rather than just wait for the Sherman flail tanks, because had he done that, it would have taken even longer. And so by about 4 o'clock, they are ready to make a second attack, this time with armoured support. And with the armour, they are able to get into the strong point through the barbed wire, through the minefield. The tanks can spread out. They start hitting the cupolas, these armoured cupolas. They still can't destroy them, but an armoured piercing shell hitting a steel cupola is going to get the gunner's head down at least. And the infantry are then able to swarm in amongst the tanks and get close enough to these trenches, these cupolas, to start neutralizing the defenders within. And over the course of the next hour, they eventually overpower the open German positions. German defenders remain in some of the underground bunkers. And in fact, they don't surrender until the following morning, but they have at least neutralized the strong point by about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, many people, the first person to do it was Wilmot in his book about D-Day in the early 50s, have criticized this and said it was far too slow. And that sort of narrative of the Suffolks not really clearing their objectives with sufficient pace has sort of been a legacy ever since Wilmot first wrote that. Colonel Goodwin took him to task with some correspondence, which is now in the Imperial War Museum archives and is a fascinating read. Wilmot climbs down a little bit, Chester Wilmot, the journalist this is, and when he has the second edition of his book published, he does at least include Goodwin's point of view. Although I think he could have done more to correct the record. It's a very difficult battle to try and correct the mythology on, if you like. I think the Suffolks did a good job with the resources and the time available to them against an incredibly strong German position. 2 belts of barbed wire, 2 minefields, numerous bunkers that are resisting, the heaviest artillery fire, plus these steel cupolas that provide a massive defensive advantage. The inability to call in Royal Navy support, although even that wouldn't have destroyed the site. The Suffolks had a tough nut to crack. And they've been criticised for it ever since Chester Wilmot wrote his book, and I think it's unjustified, to be honest. I think they had a very tough assignment, and they did the best they can in the circumstances that they had. Otherwise, it would have just been, the Somme just rushing people pointlessly over to no advantage. Had they tried to make a sort of mass attack, as some people have suggested, if they just rushed the strong point, I think the casualties would have been horrendous.
Yeah, I've always wondered with that is if people were treated differently had it been on a beach rather than inland. There's almost this kind of thing of we're off the beach now. Why aren't you moving faster?
And people have said that this held up the advance on Caen, but it really didn't, because 185 Brigade and the Staffordshire Yeomanry and the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, they're able to bypass Hillman quite successfully. They get over the Perrier Ridge during the first attack by the Suffolks. So in fact, the Suffolks are able to distract enough attention that Hillman can't engage the other troops that at this point are now advancing past it. So the Suffolks did their job in that they prevented Hillman from interfering with the advance, at least on one side. On the eastern side, the Norfolks try and get around the other side of Hillman. They do get engaged with it and they get slowed down as a result. But I think it's rather harsh to criticize the Suffolks for not doing it fast enough. When I think this is written by people who weren't there, who don't necessarily appreciate the scale of the site they had to attack and what it required. But
again, I'm looking at your maps and sorry, go ahead, mate.
Oh no, you carry on.
I was just going to say I'm looking at the maps, and I mean, Bear does not describe the terrain well enough. It's just You know, like you said, it would have been First World War kind of
Yeah.
style of First World War results, you know.
Yeah. So yeah, this is sort of what's happening to all of the individual battalions. Second East Yorks, they have to make 2 set piece attacks on 2 strong points. One is Hill 20 or strong point. One of the fish ones. I forget the name now. They attack that one, and then they attack another one just inland from it, not long after. Which ones are they? Hang on. It is strong point. They helped Germany the dispositions. Oh yeah, they attack strong point Seoul, strong point 14, and then they move on to attack Riedelstrand on S 12, strong point 12, Daimler. And they have to make 2 sort of set piece attacks on these strong points as well to neutralize them. Like I said, 4 commando attack Weistrom, 6 commando cut the path to Pegasus Bridge for Lovett and the rest of his commandos. 41 commando attack Trout over on the western flank in Lyon-sur-Mer. They get very heavily involved there along with the South Lanks. So yeah, most of these units are getting stuck in set piece attacks, but then the follow-up units like the Norfolks and the Lincolns, they get involved, embroiled in these fights as well as they come ashore and try and maneuver past them. And you know what happens, and I try and make this point in the book, is there's a lot of distraction as units get pinned down with other actions that are happening in their vicinity. And lots of people attach blame to those units. So the Norfolks, for instance, try and bypass Hillman on the east side, and then 2 of their companies get very heavily involved in the fight for Hillman. The Lincolns, they're supposed to advance southwest and capture the town of Cresson, but they then get involved in the battle for Lyon-sur-Mer. And then people blame these units, which I find rather odd, and say, well, they shouldn't have got involved, they should have carried on to their objective. And you can't do that easily if you're being attacked in your flank. And the people that should be getting the blame for this aren't the Allied units, it's the Germans. The Germans are there. They are affecting what is happening. And it's so easy to write history from the view of the victor. And then the Germans are this anonymous group of people that just, we write about but aren't influencing events. But they are influencing events. That's why these events are happening in the way that they happen. Just like people say, no plan survives contact with the enemy. That's exactly what this is all about. The German defense of Lyon-sur-Mer against 41 Royal Marine Commando and the German defense of Hillman. These are big factors that we can't just write off and say, oh, well, we were too slow in capturing it. No, we weren't. The Germans were defending it. There's 2 parties involved here. We can't just allow ourselves to get sucked into the narrative of one party, which is the British. It's the other party as well. And it's all too easy, I think, to overlook that. And that's why we end up with what I think is quite often unfounded criticism of British units, because we're not really accounting for the German defenders. And I'm not saying the German defenders were any good necessarily. I mean, 716 Infantry Division, raised where I used to live, in fact, in Bielefeld, was only ever a static coastal defence division. They were weak. They only had 2 brigades rather than 3. They had a huge area of coast to defend, and they were stretched very thinly. But that doesn't mean that they can't still have some instances of being very effective defenders.
Yeah, well, one machine gun can hold up a company. Exactly, very well, yeah. and a company holds up a battalion. Yeah. And the other thing as well, which is with the benefit of hindsight, is now we know that Rommel wasn't there. Now we know that Hitler wasn't woken up, and you didn't know that at the time. For all you knew, you might have had the entire 21st Panzer coming at you. So
and that's another point, yeah, because the commander of 185 Brigade also comes in for a fair old bit of criticism, Brigadier Smith, because he was too nervous about the possibility of a counterattack by 21 Panzer. And so he redeploys his troops to head further east and keep the west flank strongly defended by armour. And people say, oh, this delays the landings, it's his fault we didn't get to Caen. He was right. By doing what he did, he probably saved 2 infantry battalions from being decimated by German armor. And yeah, that yeah. Again, we only write about him rather than what the Germans are doing.
Can you talk us through what 21 Panzer actually did on the day, and why it perhaps was not as much as they could have done?
So 21 Panzer, they're mainly deployed to the south of Caen. Most of their units are down there, but they do have some units to the north of Caen and to the east of the city. Now, the overnight landings by 6th Airborne Division attracts attention from one of the armoured brigades under the command of Hans von Luck, and they are ordered to go and intercept the airborne landings on the east side of the River Orne and the Caen Canal. So overnight, they're advancing up towards Pegasus Bridge on the east side of the river and canal, and start to get engaged. The rest of 21 Panzer Division and the other brigades are ordered about 7 o'clock in the morning to go and assist with this. And so the commander of, and I need to check because I can never remember his name, Oberst Hermann von Bronikowski. There we go. He's one of the...
Rolls off the tongue.
It does, doesn't it? He's in command of 22nd Panzer Regiment. And they are ordered to go and support Hans von Luck in attacking the airborne forces in the early morning of D-Day. Shortly after that, of course, the amphibious landings start on Sword Beach. And at about midday, just as he's on the verge of making contact with the airborne forces around Pegasus Bridge area, he is then ordered to redeploy to the west side of the canal and the river to engage the amphibious landings at Sword Beach. Now, this is crucial in some ways because I think had his regiment of armoured vehicles been unleashed on the airborne forces, I think the outcome of 6th Airborne's bridgehead could have been very different. Because you would have had, tanks, not very good tanks, admittedly. A lot of them were converted French armoured vehicles, but there were a number of Mark IV Panzers. You would have had tanks loose in the airborne bridgehead area. A proper armoured regiment would have come down on 6th Airborne, and 6th Airborne doesn't have any tanks. It has a couple of Tetrarchs, so I think they only land later in the day. They have a couple of anti-tank guns and Piats, but that's about it. So I think 6th Airborne's bridgehead could easily have been squeezed, possibly all the way back to Pegasus Bridge, possibly losing the bridges. But he is then ordered to get back across the river and the canal and head north from Caen to intercept what's happening at Sword Beach. So I think that might save 6th Airborne. We'll never know. This is a what-if sort of thing. But I think the outcome of what's happening across the east side of the river could have been very, very different. He is now stuck because there's no easy way to cross the river and the canal. Pegasus Bridge is in enemy hands, so you can't go that way. There is a small bridge at Colombes, just north of Caen, but that's already gridlocked and is not a particularly strong bridge. So he has to go all the way back to Caen, which has been bombed, and either pass units round to the south of Caen or drive through Caen itself. Either way, it takes time. And so he's not ready until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, where he has managed to assemble his battle group on the north side of Caen at Lebezy, which is a village north of Caen. It's now been subsumed into Caen, so it's part of the city, but at the time it was a village on the outskirts. So yeah, about 4 o'clock, he's deploying his troops. He's been reinforced by infantry troops as well that have managed to maneuver around Caen. So there's 3 battle groups ready to advance north to engage the enemy. They set off on their way at 4:30. Bronkowski's group is the easternmost of the 3, and they drive straight down the road that leads from Lebezy into the twin villages of Beauville and Beauville, which then leads up to Perrier Ridge and up towards Hillman. But there he drives slap bang into the Staffordshire Yeomanry and the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, who have just managed to reach the valley below Lebezy Woods. And so he's repulsed quite quickly. He tries to divert to the west, but the Staffordshire Yeomanry tanks quickly hammer him, and so he withdraws back up onto the Nebersey Ridge. The middle battle group, the second one, they advance further west. They get further north, but they then get engaged by more of the Staffordshire Yeomanry that are on Perrier Ridge. So B Squadron and Staffordshire Yeomanry have ensconced themselves there, and being on the high ground, they quickly neutralise this thrust. The third battle group, it doesn't have any tanks in it. It's armoured cars, it's infantry, Panzer Grenadiers. They are much further west, and they are essentially in the gap between Sword and Juno beaches. And because of the German defence of Lyon-sur-Mer, 9th Infantry Brigade hasn't been able to deploy to fill that gap. And so they are able to race crossfields all the way down to the beach behind Lyon-sur-Mer and actually reinforce the defenders of Lyon-sur-Mer that have been holding out against 41 Royal Marine Commando. They get down there in the full expectation that the tanks will join them soon, and they'll be able to counterattack east into the Sword beachhead, or maybe west into the Juno beachhead. Of course, those tanks never arrive because those two battle groups were repulsed by the Staffordshire Yeomanry. And so their chance to make a strong counterattack into the flank of the Sword beach landings is lost because they don't have the armoured support to do it. 9 o'clock that night, 6th Airborne's 6th Air Landing Brigade passes overhead, so hundreds of gliders fly over the beaches. The German defenders at Lyon-sur-Mer immediately think, oh, they're going to land behind us, we'll be cut off. So they withdraw, hightail it pell-mell all the way back to Caen, basically. The airborne forces, of course, aren't landing behind them. They cut east and land over in the bridgehead area, further reinforcing those defences against Hans von Luck's brigade that's trying to attack them from the south. And so, the 21st Panzer Division's counterattack is blunted. And I mean, the reason for it is, a mix of orders. Their commander, General I can never pronounce this, Futinger, was absent on the night of the landings. There's various stories about where he was, not all savoury. And he isn't there to issue commands. It's only when the corps commander takes command and orders units forward that 21st Panzer Division is properly being mobilised, but they attack piecemeal, spread out across a wide area across too long a period of time. One brigade east of the river, another brigade on the west of the river, and they're not able to assemble themselves as a large fighting unit until too late in the afternoon, 4 o'clock. And that's because their units are scattered around the south of Caen primarily, and some on the north side. So by being committed piecemeal to the battle too late, they don't influence it. That's not fair to the British, though, because if the British hadn't repulsed those two armoured battle groups, Opintingers, Bronikowski's, sorry, then the outcome would have been very different. And there was more judgment than luck that the British were where they were, and the Staffordshire Yeomanry were able to deploy to hit those two armoured battle groups. They'd managed to get themselves into a very good position to do that. And they, it's not an exaggeration to say they might have saved the landings at Sword. Because if they hadn't been where they were, then, the Germans might have been able to run amok through the isolated battalions that still, there was no front line at this stage. This is individual units in individual settlements or parts of the battlefield with big gaps between them. So having the Staffordshire Yeomanry right at the tip of the spear as they were, they managed to repulse the Germans.
Was air power and naval power an important kind of factor in these as well, or was it? No,
I mean the naval power certainly. The infantry were able to call on naval gunfire support throughout the advance, but most of them, it was very patchy. The forward bombardment officers for observing for the Royal Navy warships, they come ashore under fire. Several of them are killed. Others lose their equipment. 41 Royal Marine Commando, they advance into Lyon-sur-Mer. They have their officer, but he's lost his radio. He's not able to get another radio until the afternoon. And when he does get it, it's crucial because he calls in firepower from their allocated destroyer, which is the Polish destroyer Slazak. And their gunfire support breaks up one of the German counterattacks in Lyon-sur-Mer, probably stabilizes that front. Without it, then possibly 41 Royal Marine Commando might have had to withdraw back to the beach, which would have been very, very bad. At other places, the warships were able to provide bombardments on some of the strong points before the attacks went in. A couple of instances in the logs for the bigger battleships, Warspite and Roberts, they do recount being requested to fire on particular areas or particular troop concentrations. Air power as well. There wasn't a huge amount of communication between the ground forces and the RAF on D-Day itself, but they were able to attack targets of opportunity, mainly a bit further away from the landings, though. Their mission was to intercept units south of Caen before they can advance up to the battlefield and try and nuke them. That better liaison between the sea, land, and air doesn't really happen until after D-Day. So it's in the period that follows up once front line has stabilized, once communications are better established, you have more units ashore to carry out this liaison role. On D-Day, it's all a little bit too fluid to have that level of accurate support.
And what about the Luftwaffe? Are they putting in an appearance over Sword?
Yeah, they are. If you watch The Longest Day, you see, what's his name? Major Phipps, I think he is, and his wingmen fly down the beaches and machine gun targets. That's actually Sword Beach. They fly over Sword Beach. They were, just as the film depicts, ordered into the air, even though they only had 2 aircraft, because the previous day his squadron had relocated to another aerodrome somewhere else, just leaving him and his wingman. They took off, flew down to the beaches from the east, dropped out of the clouds, saw the invasion fleet, and basically strafed Sword Beach before pulling back up into the clouds and then withdrawing. But that's quite often said that was the only appearance by the Luftwaffe on D-Day. That's not the case. There were at least 3 other raids by German twin-engine bombers on Sword Beach on D-Day. Junkers 88s primarily, who bombed some of the vessels and bombed the beaches, and at other beaches as well. They put in a brief appearance. And then overnight, the Luftwaffe bombs the Royal Navy and the beaches, and there's a big air raid on the anchorage after darkness falls at about 11-12 o'clock. And this is actually the start of the Luftwaffe's biggest contribution to the Normandy campaign, is bombing the beaches and the beachhead, and the anchorage areas overnight, mainly dropping mines. So they drop vast numbers of sea mines into the water off the Normandy beaches, right up until the end of the battle for Normandy. And every morning they have to be swept. All those mines detonate when a ship passes over them, because these are freshly sown mines and nobody's aware of where they are. And in fact, LCH 185, the landing craft I mentioned that I was helping John Henry Phillips with, that hits probably an acoustic mine on the 25th of June and sinks very, very rapidly, just capsizes and drops to the seabed. That's why we were looking for her wreck, because later on in the campaign, a bit of the campaign that's largely forgotten, really, is what's still happening at sea and the effect of the Luftwaffe night after night going and attacking these sites.
So by the end of D-Day, then, what is the kind of the situation? I'm going to say Sword Beach, but the units that landed at Sword Beach and the kind of I guess you could say what the kind of the final positions, maybe the kind of the prognosis for what's going to be going on a day or two.
So it's pretty healthy. It's not the ideal front line that had been drawn on a map weeks ago, and the ideal link up between all of the beaches. We haven't managed to link up with Juno Beach. 41 Commando were held in Lyon-sur-Mer, so there was no link up, and there wouldn't be until the next day. But the Commandos have got across Pegasus Bridge and linked up with the airborne, and infantry units have also caught up. And by midnight, the Warwickshire Battalion have detached one of their companies to relieve Howard and Pine Coffin and their men defending the bridges, so that they can now withdraw back into the airborne bridgehead and rejoin their units. So we have ground contact with the bridges, with the airborne forces, and we have a sort of not quite continuous front line, but we hold all the roads, the transport network towards Pegasus Bridge from the beaches. And we have units that are ensconced on the high ground behind the beach, so the Germans aren't going to get back on there very easily. We have forward units almost as far as Lebezy Ridge. In fact, overnight, we have troops who've got into the woods at Lebezy, the hill that sits above Caen, and are trying to clear it, but they withdraw when darkness falls because they can't make any headway. There is a big gap down the east side, though. Like I said, 41 Commando haven't managed to get through Lyon-sur-Mer, and so we haven't linked up with Juno. But we have 9th Infantry Brigade ready to exploit that the next day, and in fact they do. The Germans withdraw from Lyon-sur-Mer, 9th Infantry Brigade move in, occupy that gap, and link up with the Juno forces later in that afternoon. And then Strongpoint Trout in Lyon-sur-Mer surrenders the following day on the 8th. The big problem is Lebezy Ridge. So although we had repulsed the German counterattack, because they then withdrew straight back onto Lebezy Ridge, which is the high ground overlooking Caen behind them and overlooking the Allied advance in the valley below, in front of them to the north, and they dug in. And all the tanks were put into tank pits, so very low profile. They quickly reinforced the trenches. They have sheltered woodland, and in front of them a ridge dropping down that the Allies would have to attack up in order to oust them. So they very quickly reinforce this position on Lebezy Ridge, which they hold for the next month. That is the blow to the landings at Sword is, the failure to capture Lebezy Ridge. I say failure, that's not really the right word. The fact that we weren't able to get onto that high ground overlooking Caen. And it's not until the later operations to sweep around the flanks of Caen that we managed to get onto the ridge and then advance into the northern half of Caen itself. So that's the big German buffer. And by pouring 21 Panzer Division into that ground, it gave the Germans time for the remaining armoured divisions nearby, 12 SS and that sort of thing, to move up and help reinforce this defensive line.
So what were the kind of casualties sustained in at Sword or during that day? And were you able to find out kind of quite accurate figures?
I almost sort of gave up trying because it is quite complicated. As I said, one of the study units did look at the number of casualties sustained in the first wave or on the beach or inland and that sort of thing. And they are informative, but they're not complete because not every unit returned its casualties. They didn't note them down. So I shied away from trying to put a total number of casualties on anything because you could do it just for the beach based on a study, but those records were incomplete and it's hard to know what casualties they suffered inland. And then there's all of these other units that don't record casualties at all. So it's very difficult to know, what their contribution would be to that figure. Probably the heaviest casualties were suffered by the 2nd East Yorks. They took 60 men killed. And 120 wounded or something like that, which are quite high figures. And there's 2 platoons of men killed. The Suffolks took relatively low casualties. The South Lancs sort of average between the two. The Commandos took quite heavy casualties, but again, none of them sort of formation decimating. They still had all of their platoons, all of their companies intact, just with dwindling numbers. The total number of casualties for Sword Sector on D-Day, there's a number that eluded me, but it certainly runs into several hundred killed. And, well, yeah, I mean, probably at least double that wounded. But yeah, I decided, I did start doing the statistics, and then I decided not to effectively try and put a count on it, because it would be difficult. I did look at the total number of dead buried in Hermanville Cemetery who had been killed on the 6th, and I can't remember the figure for that now, awkwardly. But it's a lot. It's not as The Longest Day depicts a stroll up the beach and then being toasted by a mayor in a fireman's helmet with champagne. Never quite understood that. Right, he's an amalgamation of a couple of different characters, actually, but yeah, it certainly had its losses. Hang on, I'll just see if I can pull up one of the stats, which is informative. But yeah, it's hard to know exactly, and it's hard on all of the beaches, and this is why the American figure on Omaha is getting reevaluated so often.
Yeah, I mean, on the 2 East Yorks one, I mean, I kind of I looked into the battle of theirs I mentioned with Bangor King, and that one I forget the exact number myself, but it was around 150, and I think that's what always blows my mind about this European campaign is your battalion lands, in the case of the 2 East Yorks, 200 casualties, and then you go through months and months of campaign. And then you might have another day where you lose 150, you get casualties again, they're wounded. And a lot of those guys who were wounded that day with 2 East Yorks, they go back, they get patched up, and then they come back into the fight. That's,
Yes.
The other thing about it, is there's no, minus an arm or a leg unless you've got something like that, you're getting patched up and you're coming back into the fight. And they might have not been very far from where they left them. I've heard stories of guys getting wounded in Normandy, going back, being treated, convalescing, and coming back, and their units maybe 100 yards further forward. And, it's quite...
So, Second East Yorks, 5 officers and 60 other ranks killed. Wounded 4 officers and 137 other ranks, and 3 other ranks missing. So that's 200 other ranks casualties and 9 officers. That's quite high figures, and that's for one of the assault battalions.
Yeah, I mean that's what 25% of a battalion. Battalion.
It's about there, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's not including the support element of the battalion as well. If you take it from rifle companies, it's obviously higher.
So here's some of the statistics that were compiled. And one of the things I noticed about this is that they found that the Second East Yorks, they didn't include their figures in this study because they didn't have the figures available to them when they were doing it, which I find odd because those figures are in the war diary. But
right, yeah.
So casualties sustained by the battalion on the beaches, the first South Lancs, they estimate about 126, and then sustained by the battalion throughout D-Day, 128. Kind of those first wave casualties, about 50. It's very difficult to work it out exactly because it's all done piecemeal through studies like this. 6th Commando said something less than 10 wounded, which is not true because I know that several of 6th Commando were killed on the advance to Pegasus Bridge. 41 Commando, approximately 30. 3 Commando, because a few. 45 Commando, probably nil. 2 Machine Gun A Company, a number. It's like this. This is what they pulled from the war diaries. So yeah, it's hard to to work this out. And there is a study to be done where you could go through, at the very least, the Commonwealth War Graves records and compile that and add it into everything. It's not something I attempted to do, mainly because of the time it would take. And it still only gives you the killed, not the wounded. And so, working it out is...
Yeah, I mean, I've been going through all diaries, and I know for a fact that someone was killed or wounded that day, and that they're not mentioned at things. And and then if you can search and say, okay, I'm going to look for this unit on the Commonwealth War Graves of this day, but then that doesn't include people who died from wounds or maybe missing, who were later,
And there's many men who, with a particular regiment, they're recorded with a regiment, commandos in particular, but not with the unit they were actually serving with. And so, that makes it harder as well. Yeah,
just to explain that to people, if you might have volunteered for the commandos from, the Royal Welsh and then Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and then your death on the Commonwealth War Graves might be recorded with your original regiment rather than the commando, which it does then sometimes say it in the notes, but doesn't come up on the search. So it's difficult to piece together.
This is one of the figures from this study that was compiled by observers after the battle. And for Sword Beach, they took all of the available information that they had. Bear in mind, this is a couple of weeks after D-Day. And their best estimates they gave a lower limit, a best estimate, and an upper limit. So if I just look at the best estimate, the sort of average, they believed that in the first 45 minutes of the landings, there were probably 502 casualties on the beach. And then following that, another 92 in the later part of the morning. So... And then with assault casualties and then follow-up troops, they subdivide these and so forth. But their best estimate was approximately 630 casualties on the beach on D-Day. And that doesn't include fighting further inland. But that's what happens actually on the sand, on the waterfront area. And I think from everything I've read, I did think that number was probably, close to the mark. And I would probably up it if we're going to talk about the fighting inland, because some of the battles were quite bloody. But it's probably less than 1,000, but still numbering well into the hundreds.
Safe to say, horrific. So when
like I said, sorry, just going back.
No, go ahead, man.
Statistics-wise, Omaha Beach, 2,000 casualties, maybe 2,500, 600 of those are fatal. But that's a beach that is 3.5 miles wide, and Sword Beach is just 1 mile wide. So the average is pretty similar. And I don't really like the sort of idea of competing the beaches against each other, which was the bloodiest. I think they're all pretty bad, basically. Like I said, Utah, possibly a little bit easier for various reasons.
And then even then with Utah, the guys would say themselves, their D-Day was D+1 when they had to cross those open fields. I remember a guy, he said I can't remember if he said he lost one guy from his squad on D-Day, but then he said the next day he lost almost everyone, on D2. So like you said, I think this idea of like ranking the beaches almost is a bit of a silly one. I understand where it comes from, of course, because but like yes. So you've kind of mentioned how you went about your research, but when you were doing it, what was it like? Was there anything where you'd kind of gone in with an idea of what of one aspect of D-Day or Sword Beach in particular, and came out with a totally different one? Was there something that really kind of surprised you?
I thought I knew more than I did. So after I got the contract to write the book, I kind of thought, I know all of this. This will be easy now. I just need to write it. And then the trouble is I went into granular detail, as you've seen. I follow individual men and I pick apart individual accounts and mix them all together. And so whilst I knew what happens on Sword Beach, it's mainly the stuff that happens inland, the Staffordshire Yeomanry's advance and that sort of thing. I suddenly thought, oh hell, I've got to do a lot more reading now. So, yeah, that I don't think that surprised me, but it was certainly something that struck me as like, oh damn, I'm going into so much detail now that I need to completely reread everything and everything else I can find to achieve the same level of detail on all aspects of the book. In terms of stuff that surprised me, I think it was quite a few of the myth busting things. Some of the stuff that I'd accepted or heard about and then realized just couldn't possibly be the case. I mean, some stuff I'd always questioned. There's the account of this resistance man, Monsieur Lefebvre, who is encountered by the French commandos as they advance into Ouistreham. And the story goes, and it's in this book, March Past by Lord Lovat, and it's been recounted numerous times since, that Monsieur Lefebvre crept out during the bombardment of the beaches and snuck into the German strongpoints to cut the pipelines that carried fuel to the flamethrowers positioned on the beach. And it just didn't happen. There's no way it could have happened for a start to get into a strongpoint like Bass and neutralize flamethrowers, but also he never claimed to have done so. When you go back through the original records, the one person who he met was Commandant Kiefer, and Kiefer does not recount this conversation at all. Instead, it's one of the other commandos who never met Lefebvre, it's McDougall, I think, who claims that this happened, and that's been repeated ever since. And then it's repeated by Lovett, and now it's in almost every commando memoir from Dido. That didn't surprise me because I was always very suspicious of that, because I often thought, sorry, how did he do this? And then when I found the evidence that, yeah, he never claims to have done so, that for me sort of capped it. But ones that surprise me. Oh, and there's bits I never knew about, I suppose. The second battle for Ouistreham, when the 77 Assault Squadron, the AVREs, Hobart's Funnies, attack the lock gates in Ouistreham Centre. So after you get off the ferry at Ouistreham, you have the locks just on your left, and there's a square with lots of bars. And there was a big battle there between the Royal Engineers, and they're coming down in their armoured vehicle, Royal Engineer Churchill tanks, engaging the strong point there, which is strong point number 8, I think, strong point number 9, in an unsupported attack. This is just armour. No infantry support. It's just these tanks take on this German strongpoint, and they do it. They knock out the strongpoint. They secure the locks. Unfortunately, the Germans are able to blow up one of the bridges that crosses over the canal entrance. But otherwise, they secure the position really well. And I didn't know about that until I came to write this book, and I was going through their reports for the landings. And then they all carry on and say, in the afternoon, we made this attack, and they start describing this. I was like, oh, I didn't know anything about this. That was a really nice bit to include, because that was news to me. So it was, a whole new story. And as I was reading their reports, I had no idea how this was going to unfold. So it was quite interesting.
We've only just scratched the surface of what is in this book. And I should tell people as well, which, it's, because obviously, we have people listening on audio here. The book is available on audiobook as well. I would suggest getting a copy, of a physical copy for the maps if you are someone that enjoys audiobooks, which I am myself, to be honest, especially when mowing the lawn. So there's that kind of side that with the book with the maps is something that obviously you can't get from the audiobooks, but definitely, because I know not everyone is as much of a book fiend as we are. But I want to kind of talk about remembrance and anniversaries in a moment. But before we go on to that, like you said, we scratched the surface. But is there anything else about just D-Day itself that you'd like to say before we kind of move on to the anniversary remembrance aspect?
I mean, D-Day is one of the biggest operations in the world, or certainly in world military history. We're kind of inclined to think it's one of the most covered, and we know everything. and we just don't. There's so much more still to learn about D-Day, particularly, I would say, on the British beaches, and in British, I'm including Juneau, which was part of the British area. I think, like I said, everything I talked about with Sword and the lack of publications about it, that applies to gold as well. And yes, I will do one on gold. And I know lots of people would like me to do gold, and I will, because that's lacking a comprehensive retelling as well. There's plenty of memoirs that cover gold, or there's books like James Holland's book, Brothers in Arms, that follow specific units, but the entire story of gold hasn't been joined together properly yet. And I think that's another big gap. And I would say the same for Juno. A few Canadian authors have tackled it, but in fairness, they've concentrated on the Canadian units. And I think the other part that always fails to get a look in is the Navy. And I tried to include the Navy as much as possible in my book. And Nick Hewitt, a good friend of mine, he's also done a good effort on the Navy. His book, The Sailor's Story, came out last year, and it's starting to correct that imbalance. But there's, any book that you write about D-Day now, I think should have more coverage of the Navy, because so many of them just start when the soldiers touch the beach, and the Navy is seen as this sort of taxi service that's pushing them ashore, but they're very much involved in the battle as well. And I think there's much more that can be extracted from the Navy. And I think there's the one thing I hope that Sword Beach has shown people is that there's so many stories that just haven't been put to paper yet, and it's because it's such a big event. Each individual beach is swallowed by the greater story. If Sword Beach had been in isolation, if it had just been one event, an amphibious landing by a British reinforced division, it would have had dozens of books written about it. Just like, say, Arnhem, because it's one unit, it's easier to write about in isolation. But because it was part of this bigger event, it's been swallowed up by the bigger narrative of D-Day as a whole. So I think, the one thing I would say about D-Day is there's still an awful lot more to learn and to read about, ultimately.
Yeah, I totally agree, mate. Like, this, is, and then not just D-Day itself. I mean, I think, I've sometimes asked myself, I'm like, is there an point in doing a book that's been told? And then you start going into things and looking for interviews and finding little memoirs and things like that. And when there's millions of people involved, there's millions of stories to tell. And like you said, it's such an intricate dance, this whole thing that was put together as well. So to have that kind of level of detail that you've worked out of how these parts move together, and one informs the other, right? If something hadn't happened here, this could have happened there. It's incredible. I couldn't recommend people couldn't recommend highly enough that people go out and pick this up.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome, mate. Like I said, I enjoy what I do, but my work is very much concentrated on soldiers. I always say it's about what a soldier felt and experienced, and that's not always what happens. I'm very clear about what a soldier feels and experiences, especially when he's interviewed 60 years later. That tells a snapshot from one little angle onto a massive event. So it's kind of books like this that allow me to do what I do. So I'm very grateful for them. I did just really kind of want to pick your brains, because obviously we just kind of come past VE Day, which I felt had a very different kind of coverage to D-Day. What was your kind of thoughts on the D-Day, the 80th anniversary, obviously the most recent one that we've had until obviously today, the 81st, and how do you kind of see that going forwards? And from the time that you've spent in France, do you feel confident that this is something that is going to be continue to be remembered, continue to be honored?
Yeah, definitely. I don't see the memorialization of D-Day stopping anytime soon. There's a couple of different reasons for that, but it's such a seminal event in world history. The start of the liberation of Europe. Obviously, that's not quite technically correct. We were already ashore in Italy and elsewhere, but in terms of the the battle that was going to actually change the status of the Second World War much more quickly than, say, the Italian campaign, was definitely going to be landing in Northwest Europe. It was what everything had been building up to for the past 4 years. And, this was clearly going to be, and of course did prove to be, the event that would eventually lead to the downfall of Germany in Western Europe. And we can talk about Russia separately, but in terms of actually liberating Western Europe, it was D-Day that was going to be the start of that, and that alone makes it something that will be remembered, I think, beyond the generations that were involved in it. I don't think people will stop remembering just when we lose our last veterans. I think there's too much of a legacy now. And from an archaeological perspective, that legacy is very much still very present in Normandy and on the south coast of England. The concrete that still survives is, everywhere. There is so much of a physical legacy of D-Day that again will keep it very much to the fore. And you have to acknowledge the sort of more commercial aspect of it. These are tourism sites. People want to go there to see these places. And it's probably quite a big part of Normandy's economy nowadays. But, there's so many museums along the beachfront area that there is a destination for people to go to. So as long as they're there, people will continue to go. And that's a good thing because it encourages remembrance. And so people will learn about this and they will continue to visit and it will continue to remain in the public consciousness. So, I don't see it stopping anytime soon, if ever, to be honest. It's because it comes from a period of history that is so well recorded in so many different ways. We have photographs and film footage and the physical evidence of what happened on D-Day. We don't commemorate events like Agincourt. That was the battle I couldn't remember the name of. in the same way, because these are events from not quite ancient history, but long time ago that we don't have the same connection to and that we don't have the same record for. If we knew more about Agincourt, if we had a physical place to go to, we have a field, but it's just a field, and if there were more accounts and photographs and that sort of thing, it would be easier to remember these things and to commemorate them or even celebrate them. And I wouldn't use the word celebrate for D-Day, but because we have such a modern connection, if you like, in terms of the literature available to us, photos, films, museums, sites, buildings, structures, all of that sort of stuff, it makes it easier to remember these places as well, on a much more comprehensive level than older events from history.
All right, guys, there we go. Sword Beach with Mr. Stephen Fisher. Thank you for listening today. As I said at the beginning of the episode, if you could share something that you've just listened to for 3 hours, sitting down, mowing the lawn, whatever you're doing, if you thought it was worth sitting through, if you thought it was interesting, if you thought you learned something, then please do share it. It's the only way we're going to grow. I'd love to have the money to spend on big advertising campaigns and anything like that to grow the podcast, but I don't. So it's down to you guys. If you thought this was worth listening to, then please do share it. If you wanted to pick up a copy of Stephen's book, and if you wanted to pick up a copy of my book on D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, then, please do. You can get both of them in Tesco. You can pick the pair of them up, I think, for 12 quid. If you want the links, I'll put them down in the show notes. If you could get the books, guys, that would be brilliant. I'd really appreciate it. But if you could share the post, share a post. So if you can make a post, if you could share the episode, that doesn't cost anything except a couple minutes of your time. So if you could give that, I'd really appreciate it. Love to see these episodes growing. As I said at the beginning of the episode, guys, I will keep doing this if there's one person listening. I'd rather that one person wasn't me. But, we'll keep going, guys. We'll keep putting these out. This is something that I foresee doing for the long, long haul. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of stories out there, and we want to get them down, to get them documented, not just for ourselves, but for future generations as well. So thanks so much for your time today, guys. Really do appreciate it. And catch you again in about 10 days. Until then, thanks for listening to the War Story Podcast.